We're live.
Great. Good afternoon. It's Monday, the 15th of February. This is the House Judiciary Committee, and we're going to start hearings today. We have a number of bills on our docket. There are 8 bills, and we are going to begin with the Vice Chair's bill, House Bill 1035. There are 1, 2, 3. Well, okay, so there are 2 testifying in favor, there are 2 testifying with amendments, and then there are 2 opposed. So we're going to hear from the Vice Chair first for 3 minutes, and then DeRay McKesson and Sam Singyangwe for 2 minutes each after that. So with that, the Vice Chair, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, members of the committee. I'm Delegate Vanessa Atterbury, here asking for your favorable support of House Bill 1035. Essentially, what House Bill 1035 does, it establishes an independent prosecution unit in the Office of the Attorney General if there has been an incident involving the police and death or serious bodily injury of a Maryland citizen. Should, for whatever reason, the Office of the Attorney General decide not to prosecute in that case, then the local state's attorney will have an option to prosecute. This piece of legislation will provide transparency because if you take a look at the legislation, the independent prosecution unit is required to provide a written report of the investigation with the local state's attorney's office and also with the public. Recently, during the interim, in fact, while the Police Reform and Accountability Work Group was meeting, a Goucher poll was done, which said that 85% of Marylanders support an independent prosecution in police-involved deaths. So this is not just what people across the country are asking for, this is what the citizens of Maryland are asking for. You will hear about the close relationship between the police and the prosecutors and why investigations might be hindered. The ACLU across the country has taken this position, and this is simply because individuals who are victims of police death and brutality, their families deserve timely, thorough, and unbiased prosecutions. This is not a punishment for those jurisdictions in the state of Maryland that would in fact prosecute these type of cases. And as many of you know, there are folks in the General Assembly who have been pushing for justice for Anton Black. This is that situation. This is that exact situation. The state's attorney in Caroline County refused to prosecute after Anton Black had been murdered. Had that murder taken place in Prince George's or in Baltimore City, I'm sure those state's attorneys would have prosecuted. So what we can't have in Maryland is justice depending on where you reside. And you've probably read in the news that now the family of Anton Black is seeking justice in the federal courts civilly. They recently filed in action. So this bill is to ensure that all Marylanders will have access to justice should there be an unfortunate incident involving the police and the death of a Marylander or serious bodily injury. And with that, thank you, Mr. Chair, I'll end.
Muted. We'll go for now for 2 minutes to DeRay McKesson, please, for 2 minutes.
Hello, it's an honor to be here before the committee. I'm DeRay McKesson, one of the co-founders of Campaign Zero. I would just second everything that Delegate Atterbury said and also remind the committee that since 2013, which is as far as we have data, a reminder that the police in Maryland have killed 134 people. Only in 2 of those cases has any officer been charged with a crime, and in no case has any officer ever been prosecuted. So the current system, you know, the prosecutors will say that they are the best equipped to do it, that they are the ones who really understand. We've actually just not seen that happen in any of the data that we actually have. So what's really powerful about this bill as a model is that it both creates space for the Attorney General, and it also leaves space open for local state's attorneys to intervene if they need to. And this is really a model piece of legislation. Again, when we look at the data, we've not seen prosecutors actually hold police accountable in these cases. at all for as long as we have data. The last thing I'll say is that the current way the system is set up is that it allows the prosecutor, or requires really, the prosecutor to be the arbiter of their own impartiality to determine their own conflicts of interest. And that just hasn't worked out. We shouldn't design a system that requires there to be good people at every step of the way. We should actually just have a system that works, whether or not the people are good in it in the first place.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to Sam Sing-Yangwei, please.
Good afternoon. So I'll just follow up on some of what was said by Delegate Atterbury as well as DeRay McKesson. So good afternoon. I'm Sam Sing-Yangwei, one of the co-founders of Campaign Zero. And like has been said, in the state of Maryland, we have not yet seen a conviction. For as far back as we have data on killings by police, we have yet to see an officer being convicted of a crime for killing somebody in the state of Maryland. I mean, who would say, among us would say that there has not been a single incident of criminal misconduct by the police that has resulted in death since 2013. We have seen the cases, we have seen the videos. The problem is not that there is an absence of misconduct. It is rather that the current system does not allow for an impartial investigation and prosecution of these cases. It is dependent on local prosecutors who often have conflicts of interest, as has been said, and as the ACLU has established in their research, conflicts of interest with local police departments. We need to remove that conflict of interest, create a statewide agency, as HB 1035 does, a statewide, out of the AG's office, prosecution of these cases. This is following a trend that we're seeing in other states. We just saw in California this past year, passed legislation to establish something similar. In New York, for several years now, they have been investigating and prosecuting cases of killings by the police out of the state attorney general's office. So again, this is Connecticut, similar story around independent investigations and prosecutions. So there are a set of states now that have recognized that this is a problem, have reviewed the data and seen that there has been no accountability, zero accountability by the criminal justice system when it comes to holding police accountable for fatal police violence. That's why we need this legislation. That's why we need to change this system, remove that conflict of interest, and have statewide investigations and prosecutions of these cases so that we can finally see that these police officers are held accountable for violating the public's trust.
All right, are there questions for this panel? Delegate Moon, and then Delegates Arakan and Cox.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple basic questions. One, is this bill instead of or on top of language, I guess, in the speaker's bill about investigation and prosecution? I just trying to understand the sort of framework we should be trying to think about this in. The other is just on how this would work. So it looks like you're covering when the police kill someone. But what happens in the rest of the cases? If the police shoot someone and they don't die, would the alternative be that just the state's attorneys?
So thank you, Delegate Moon. I'll try to answer that question. So in terms of how this relates or works with House Bill 670, if you recall in the work group, we did not make a recommendation related to independent prosecution of these types of incidents. So what this says is, but what we did do is say there should be an independent investigation, right? So this bill says that the independent prosecution unit will work with a law enforcement agency, which is doing that investigation. So it would work in that sense with House Bill 670. And your second question was related to when there was not a death, correct? Okay. So if, as written right now, it says if there has been serious bodily injury, the independent law enforcement prosecution unit will work with the independent investigatory unit and look into whether or not that should be prosecuted as well. So it's death and serious bodily injury.
Let's go now to Delegate Arakan, please.
Mr. Chairman, this question's for Mr. Sing-Yangwei. Am I saying that right? So you touched on the fact that a lot of cases that we've seen videos of haven't been prosecuted and people haven't been found guilty. I guess I heard you insinuate that that was a failure of the prosecutors and the DAs, but it also could be that they can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Just because we have video evidence doesn't mean it can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Isn't that accurate?
So I would disagree with that. I think this is obviously a complex issue. It does implicate the deadly force statutes, which we have talked about. There's legislation addressing that can make it easier for prosecutors to demonstrate that the police violated the law. But nevertheless, when you look at the data on cases in which officers are prosecuted across the country, again, as DeRay said, we manage the most comprehensive database of people killed by police in the country, going all the way back to 2013 to the present day. There are several hundred cases in which police have been indicted across the country. And when you see where these indictments happen, where the officers are actually charged, it tends to be in a handful of places where officers are repeatedly, in cases, are repeatedly charged. So places like in Dallas, where we've seen three or four indictments over the past couple of years of officers who've killed people. It's also places like in Portsmouth, Virginia, where prosecutors have been able to secure indictments in multiple cases. So what that tells us is that if you have the right prosecutor, despite all of those limitations, the limitations of being able to convince beyond reasonable doubt that the officer broke the law, the limitations in the deadly force statutes being too permissive, all of those things taken into account, there are places in which prosecutors are repeatedly able to charge and, yes, even convict officers for killing people. And so it's not impossible. What we are seeing, though, is that it's concentrated in a very small number of counties in which this happens, where you just happen to have a prosecutor who is committed to holding the police accountable. What this legislation would do is replicate that at the state level so that it doesn't depend on whether you happen to be in the right county. It should be that for everybody in your state, you should be able to rely on and depend on the criminal justice system to step in and hold the police accountable.
Okay, so your opinion then would be that State's Attorney Mosby is not one of those people because she did prosecute police officers for what looked like misconduct on video, and she did not secure guilty verdicts. So would she fall into the latter category of failed prosecutors in this respect, or is there a sweet spot you're looking for with prosecutors? I mean, I think she tried.
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously I can't comment on the specifics of the case. There was a lot that happened with that case. But I do think that what we have seen is that there are prosecutors who've been able to indict cops repeatedly. And not only that, but secure convictions. When we look at the data across the country on how that happens, where that happens, what it suggests is that if you can get a system in place in which you are able to replicate what works in terms of those prosecutions, you're able to put somebody in power at the state level who can make sure that even in counties where you don't have a prosecutor who's willing to secure indictments, even in obvious cases where they could, the state should be able to handle those cases and ensure that justice is done.
And is that information in your written testimony on which states are doing that and doing it effectively? Yeah,
so you can see mappingpoliceviolence.org is the database. We track.
What's it called? Can you say it again?
Mappingpoliceviolence.org.
Okay.
So you can track each case in which there has been an officer who's been charged following a killing by the police. You can also see what the results of those cases were, whether there was a conviction or not.
Okay, mappingpoliceviolence.org. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Vice Chair.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on Delegate Erican's question because she hopped on, I think, after I spoke. And so the point was, and I addressed exactly one of her questions, was that, if something happens, we can't just expect justice, and expect prosecutors in 2 jurisdictions out of 24 to possibly do the right thing, because we know that that's not done. That different prosecutors look at justice differently, and we've seen that with individuals in this body calling for the justice of Anton Black, where that instance was not prosecuted.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. I heard your whole speech, but I appreciate that answer.
All right, thank you. Are there further questions for this panel? Seeing none, thank you all very much. We'll go now to those people who have signed up to testify as favorable with amendments, and they're the state's attorneys for Prince George's in Baltimore City. So we will hear next from whoever I see first. And I believe I'm going to see, looks like State Attorney Braveboy. We'll hear from State's Attorney Braveboy for 2 minutes and then the State's Attorney for Baltimore City. State's Attorney Braveboy, go ahead for 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee. I'm here today to testify on House Bill 1035, supporting this bill with amendments. We all know, and I think I've talked to you all about all of the efforts of my office and our public integrity unit and the successful convictions that we have secured on behalf of the residents of Prince George's County. We've also indicted several officers, and those cases range from assault to rape to murder. And it is the job of the local prosecutor to hold everyone in the jurisdiction accountable, regardless of their profession. So that includes police officers as well. But we understand the need for reforms. And so we're not saying that that state's attorneys should not be held accountable for their decisions as well. And so having a system of accountability, we think, is extremely important. That's why we're supporting this bill with a very important amendment. And that amendment would allow the Attorney General to prosecute these serious bodily injuries or death cases caused by a police officer if the state's attorney's office refers the case from the outset, or where after an investigation, the state's attorney's office declines to prosecute. There would be an automatic ability for the Attorney General's office to review all of those cases. The state's attorney would be required to provide all of the investigative records to the Attorney General's office to support the Attorney General's investigations, again, in those cases where the local state's attorney declines to prosecute. And we think this is extremely important because it is the local prosecutor who has the most direct responsibility to the residents of that jurisdiction. This process will also give residents comfort in knowing that there will be at least two investigations that could be done if the local state's attorney declines to prosecute. But a system that is set up to only really focus on the Attorney General, and wonder if you have an Attorney General who makes decisions like Daniel Cameron, what real justice can someone get? Because even if the local
State's
prosecutor,
attorney,
yes.
if you could wrap up, please. Yeah.
Okay, I'm so sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much, committee.
Thank you very much. State's Attorney Mosby, please.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, distinguished members of the committee. As someone who has for years been advocating for police accountability reform for people in our state, I think it's important to understand and recognize that people keep conflating the need for an independent prosecutor versus a need for an independent police agency. Do we need oversight over prosecution? Yes. But the need for an independent police agency is what is needed even more, as was highlighted by civil rights champion Benjamin Crump in his Washington Post op-ed, where he emphasized, and this is an individual who has represented the families of Michael Brown and Trayvon Martin and Tamir Rice and Breonna Taylor. What he understands and what I need to make crystal clear to each and every one of you is that this bill, as proposed, would not have changed the results of the prosecution and lack thereof in Freddie Gray and Anton Black, respectively. This bill, as is currently proposed, would not have changed the outcome of these cases because the Attorney General would still be charged with investigating these matters, with local police departments forced to investigate their own. That means the Attorney General would not be able to do anything if the local police department wasn't inclined to ask the most pertinent questions of their academy classmates and friends. Even the Attorney General at the helm of this prosecution, the police, would still have the ability to refuse to execute search and seizure warrants that implicate their colleagues. The Attorney General would not be able to control whether the command staff chooses to assign investigators that are actually witnesses to the case. And the Attorney General would not be able to stop the police department from creating false narratives about the victims in the case in order to allow their colleagues to escape prosecution. This bill does not address the #1 systemic problem in all prosecutions, but it should, which is why we are proposing this amendment. Police should not be investigating themselves. The investigation is the most important stage of any prosecution, and arriving at a decision to prosecute, as well as the success of that prosecution, is only as good as your investigation, which is why we are proposing that local prosecutors work with an independent police agency, and if and when that local prosecutor elects not to prosecute, there would be a level of oversight which would allow the Attorney General to then step in. This system of independence would have definitely changed the outcome of the Freddie Gray case, but this additional level of oversight would have changed the outcome of Anton Black's case. Recognizing the unique moment that we are currently in, we are all here, and the number of Black lives that are at stake, let's not drop the ball and implement policies and laws that will not effectuate the type of change that we hope to achieve. And with that, I would urge that these amendments be considered in this particular bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there questions for this panel? Seeing Delegate Cox.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was trying to click that thing faster. Apologize. So this is for the Madam State's Attorneys. Thanks so much for your testimony. I heard last week from one of the state's attorneys that the Attorney General already has constitutional authority and command to investigate any criminal action or criminal suit or action in Maryland, and inclusive of police. Is that your understanding as well? I just wanted to clarify. That was, I think, Article 5, but I don't recall exactly if that was the citation.
That I'm not disputing that at all. I think that the question is, do you want to set up a system of accountability that requires the Attorney General to act? I think the Attorney General in those cases that the state declines to prosecute, or the local state's attorney declines to prosecute, there's often still sometimes a call for another review, and ensuring that there will be another review by the Attorney General's office makes sense. So whether or not they have the authority, if they don't exercise the authority, then the residents won't get the relief that they need. I think ensuring through legislation that second level of review is done is critical.
My perspective is that's not my interpretation of the Constitution. My interpretation is that we would have to, as local prosecutors, we have to give the authority for the Attorney General to step in on local matters of prosecution. As of right now, state, city, and local prosecutors have the constitutional obligation to prosecute any crimes that take place in our particular jurisdictions. It is only at that point, if we wanted to bring in and to allow, we often have to actually authorize the Attorney General to come in on those cases that they wouldn't otherwise have jurisdiction on. And so what this piece of legislation is proposing without our amendments is that constitutional ability to prosecute these cases as well as others, right? We would be giving that to the Attorney General, and in essence, taking that power away from the local prosecutors.
Thank you.
Delegate McComas.
Chair, this is for, I guess, both of the state's attorneys, Ms. Braveboy and Ms. Mosby. What would you consider the best way to handle this so you have independent investigation without any influence of political, political pressure? Because I mean, we got to be realistic. I mean, if it's the Attorney General, he's political. If it's the City of Baltimore Chief of Police, he's under the mayor, there's political. So if you had a magic wand, what would you say should be the best, fairest system that protects the citizens, that's fair to the police, that basically moves the ball to find the truth and what's right?
And if I could, I appreciate your question, Delegate. I think this is what I'm basically saying. I agree that there should be some level of oversight over certain prosecutions, right? We don't want your prosecution to be politically motivated. What we're saying is that at the start of any sort of investigation, having the ability to not have a police department to investigate their colleagues, not investigate their classmates, right? There's just an implicit sort of bias and conflict of interest that is presented when any profession investigates itself. If I have somebody in my office that is under a criminal investigation, my office isn't going to be the one that's going to conduct the investigation. And so having a local prosecutor who is elected to do that job, to work with an independent police agency, there's that in and of itself provides oversight over that local prosecutor. Right? You're not working with the people that you work with every single day in the prosecution of every type of crime. That independent police agency, that's the independence that's needed. So then on top of that local prosecutor being there at the start of that investigation, throughout that investigation, making a decision based upon that investigation as to whether or not to prosecute, if they decline to charge, you have an additional level of oversight because now you're saying they've declined, but guess what? The Attorney General can step in and look at what that local prosecutor and what that independent police agency have done. And if they've done something wrong, then guess what? The citizens of Baltimore or whatever respective jurisdiction can hold that local prosecutor accountable. So that would be the ideal situation, is to have the independence in the start, which provides the oversight, and as well as the independence on the back end, which again provides that oversight in what we're attempting to do in reform.
So for me, because we don't have this independent investigative system through state law, what I've done is engaged independent use of force experts who are former police officers who are unaffiliated with Prince George's County that assist us with investigations so that we can get an independent assessment along with whatever the agency also provides us, but we are able to get an independent report done by a qualified use of force expert we have two that have testified throughout the state of Maryland and are recognized as experts in this area of use of force. So my belief is that these independent investigations have really aided me personally. Now, we pay for them, obviously, but they've really aided me in making good decisions and preparing ourselves to try cases, including a murder case, other use of force cases, assault cases that resulted in serious bodily injury. And based on some of the expert advice in the reports, we have declined to prosecute cases. So these experts are completely independent. They have really no dog in the fight. They really are just looking at the facts, applying what the use of force standards are and giving us their independent professional assessment. And I think if that's done through an agency or the way that I'm doing it, through the use of force experts, however that is done, I think it is important that a level of independence be a part of whatever process moves forward so that the state's attorney can responsibly rely on a thorough investigation.
Delegate Moon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just trying to be very clear, I guess, about what folks are asking for here. I mean, as I break this issue down, there's really three separate questions that we're talking about here. One is who gets to do the investigation. Another is who gets to choose whether to prosecute. And then the third one is in what order do people get to decide whether to prosecute? So number 2 and 3, the whole prosecution side of this, those are very interesting questions. But I'm actually at this point curious about number 1, the investigation part. As I read this bill, and again, it's not my bill, but as I read this bill, what it appears to propose is that there is a unit, an independent unit in the Attorney General's office, and they do the investigation. They provide a report to the state's attorney about that investigation, and then they, the unit themselves, will decide first if there's a prosecution or not, and then it goes to you to make a decision if they decided not to. But at least with respect to that first part, that first step about the investigation originating with that independent unit, are you in favor of that aspect of this, or are you suggesting that aspect should go somewhere else? And if you want it to go somewhere else, where exactly would you put that?
Well, I think if you look at, I believe it's the Speaker's Bill, House Bill 670, I think there's a proposal in that bill for an independent investigative agency, to conduct the investigations on these serious bodily injury and use of force or death cases involving officers, police officers. So I think we're looking at that model as the appropriate model to move forward, and the order. So this bill is really about more so about the order, or our concerns are more so about the order of review. And if you think about it, the Attorney General is the top law enforcement in the state, office in the state. So it does not, I think, make a whole lot of sense for that office than to be reviewed by my office. I think it makes more sense for decisions of my office to be reviewed by the Attorney General's office.
And if I could just add, I think that it's definitely Senate Bill 670 is a really great starting place because it addresses what we talk about. We keep conflating independent prosecutor and independent police and independent investigations. What your prosecution is only going to be as good as your investigation, right? So at the outset, you need that independence so that the police are not policing their friends and their colleagues, right? If you have a prosecutor, a local prosecutor that is able to work with that independent agency, they will ultimately be able to arrive at whether or not to prosecute. It is only at that point that I'm suggesting that we bring in the Attorney General to oversee that declination, right? And I think that that is incredibly important. I think that distinction has to be made because we keep conflating the two and saying, oh, we need an independent prosecutor. No, we need prosecutorial oversight, right? I don't need, if I'm doing my job, I'm not afraid of Brian Frosch coming in and looking at what I've done. We've convicted 33 officers since Freddie Gray, right? Like there's a reason that, you know, the Fraternal Order of Police, they would love for me not to have the power to be able to prosecute police in the city of Baltimore. They would love for State's Attorney Brave Boy to not have the ability of prosecuting cases in the city of Baltimore. I get that, you know, these two jurisdictions, which are the largest jurisdictions in the state, that probably are plagued more so than any other place with these types of issues, right? I think that it's important to understand and to recognize that we're telling you based upon experience, you know, Ben Crump is telling you based upon experience that the crux of the issue when it comes to reform and accountability is the need for us to have independent police agencies. And that's what Senate Bill 670 does. We're asking to add on to that because we do recognize that not all my colleagues have the same sense or will appreciate the prosecution of police. If you want a level of oversight, to then bring in Brian Frosch. From a fiscal perspective, it makes sense. Why would we create a whole entire unit for the Attorney General's office for, you know, every single type of one of these types of cases? Like that's illogical.
Mr. Chair,
the crux of the issue.
If I could very, very briefly, because I believe me, I haven't settled my head on this either, the order of this, to be clear. So I'm really just trying to understand the question. Oh, yes.
Delegate Moon, I just want to clarify.
Yep.
So if you recall, the work group recommended in House Bill 670, which is based off the work group's recommendations, an independent investigation by, and it matches the language here, a law enforcement agency, which is defined in the public safety article. So this bill has the same language that's in House Bill 670. And it says the law enforcement agency will work. It doesn't say that Frosch is going to investigate. It assumes that the Attorney General is using an independent law enforcement agency as defined in the public safety article, right? Whatever that is determined to be, the state police or whatever. So just to clarify that point for you.
Oh, okay. So thank you. Just to follow up on the local state's attorneys, though. I mean, the part that I've just been wrestling with that maybe you could help me toy with is, doesn't the order, whether you like the order being state's attorneys first or attorney general first, depends on how you feel about the particular state's attorney? No, I mean, and part of what I wrestle with is, it seems like there's the possibility of bringing local taint, I guess, to that decision first. And so if it's the state's attorney declining to prosecute, which I would think is going to be more often what's happening, is that people being upset that it was a decision not to prosecute. And so now there's sort of a stamp of approval for that from the local state's attorney. And then the attorney general is having to come in, and it's, oh, here's liberal Brian Frosch from Montgomery County overruling the local person's decision. That's just, devil's advocate there.
Well,
Delegate Moon, is there a question in our future?
Well, it's just more, isn't there something to that it's not so simple as that?
But I think that could be addressed through regulation also, and how the decisions and when the decisions are made public. So if we refer them to the Office of the Attorney General, we could refer them because we believe we have a conflict, or we could refer them because internally we've made a decision not to prosecute. So that wouldn't necessarily be made public until after the Attorney General's office conducts its own investigation and makes a decision, because I don't believe either way you slice it, it makes sense to announce a declination before the reviewing agency has a chance to do its due diligence. So I think
I want to make clear, like, we shouldn't be in the business of relying on someone else's interpretation of their investigation. Like, if you want us to make the decision about whether or not we're going to prosecute, we have to be at the table. To suggest that the Attorney General is going to work with an independent agency to arrive at a conclusion, and that we're then going to base our decision as prosecutors ethically on someone else's investigation, even though we weren't involved in it, it's illogical. So what I'm proposing is that you can have oversight, you can have the independence, and you can do exactly what Ben Crump and the civil rights lawyers across the country who have experience in this work are suggesting that we do, which is to have that independent police agency.
Okay, here, committee, just so you're aware, I have a meeting with the speaker I need to attend. I'm going to recognize Delegate Grammer here in a moment, then I'm going to step away. The vice chair will take the chair. And the next bill is going to be out of order because we're trying to work with the schedule for the mayor of the city of Baltimore. We're going to do House Bill 1027 next. So with that, Delegate Grammer, with your question, and then the vice chair will take the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry for my voice being a little hoarse. Question for the Madam State's Attorney's offices. So it sounded like the chair alluded to these investigations being performed by a police office that is independent, but I wanted to clarify for myself, you're advocating for what would be a new independent police office for these investigations. Is that correct?
Yes, Delegate.
Okay.
Well, I think within the bill, it sounds like Delegate Atterbury says that the language in her bill is consistent with the language in the speaker's bill, House Bill 670, which calls for an independent investigative agency. So
the solution could be either, but there is of the opinion of some state's attorney's offices that it could be a new office. Did I hear at one point someone say that there was a framework that one of the jurisdictions was using for this kind of independent investigation office?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I said right now, I employ the services of independent use of force experts really with a lot of different types of cases. It's not just serious bodily injury or death cases, but I use it to assist me in making decisions and in the jury process as well.
And Delegate, I would just add, yes, there are other places like Georgia, and there's a couple of other places where they have the independent police agencies that work with local prosecutors. Yes, and
So
I can get that information to you.
Is that more of a, I know there are frequently cross-jurisdictional arrangements. Is that the case that you're referring to, Madam State's Attorney Mosby, or are those like a state level authority?
It's a state level authority. They have like a state agency of investigators that actually work with the local prosecutors in the inception of the investigation, right? Okay. And then, yeah.
And I'd like to know more about that. If you could maybe send me some information, maybe some backstory would help me. And Madam State's Attorney Braveboy, you said you use certain professionals. Are those like private or public, or is that like a cross-jurisdictional agreement that you have?
No, they are private. And in fact, we had a pretty high profile case where we declined to prosecute and we made the report public. We also had our use of force expert available to the public, not only during our press conference, but to meet with local the interest groups in the local city where the incident happened, and people who were interested in the decision in this case. And I thought it was really a very good model because we were able to explain, the use of force standard, the facts of the case, even provided video. It was very transparent. And I think it's really important to have a level of transparency. And that's why I engage use of force experts.
Okay, that's really good information. I appreciate that. If you could both maybe send that to the committee, I think that would be very informative. I appreciate your answers.
Thank you.
Delegate Griffith, did you still have a question? No? Okay. Thank you. Seeing no more questions, thank you both for being here. There are two unfavorables, Scott Schellenberger and Steve Kroll, so we will move to them. And while they're coming in, Delegate Grammer, Montgomery County and Howard County have a cross-jurisdictional thing, but that's the only one I know of, I believe, in the state right now.
Yeah, I know that was the case for the prosecutorial agreement. Yeah.
And so I see Scott Schellenberger, so you will have 2 minutes.
I'll get used to it sooner or later. Thank you so much, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee, Scott Schellenberger, State's Attorney on behalf of Baltimore County. So a couple things. Number one, Prince George's County and Montgomery County are not the only two jurisdictions to prosecute a police officer. Our office in 2013 prosecuted Officer Laborde for killing Christopher Brown. And after a very lengthy jury trial, he was found not guilty. And that's not the only case. We then prosecuted several years later an Officer Spivey for excessive force, and that was actually videotaped from aerial surveillance. That jury found him not guilty after 15 minutes and literally went into the hallway and shook his hands. All prosecutors in this state are doing their job, including me. This is the job I'm elected to do. If I'm not doing my job right, just like all of you, if all of you are not passing the right kind of legislation, every 4 years, we're answerable to the citizens. And I make these decisions and I stand by these decisions. And we went forward in at least 2 of the cases and we lost. It's the way the jury system works. The other problem here is that, everybody keeps talking about this independent police agency and everyone's assuming that it's going to be the Maryland State Police. But what if it's a Maryland State Trooper who did the shooting and caused the death? Then all of a sudden, who's going to investigate that? Plus now you're talking about starting an incomplete unit throughout the state. They have to be ready 24/7 to go to Ocean City, to go to Cumberland, to go to everywhere whenever these police shootings take place. You're not just going to rely on a local state trooper who happens to be in the area, and that gets more complicated if the state trooper is the one that actually did it. So I would say the other thing that's a problem is in section D of the bill, it says after the law enforcement agency has completed the investigation, they shall issue a public report of its findings. Well, what if we're going forward with a trial? A public report would impinge on the right to a fair jury trial. So at least there has to be some changes made there about the timing of when that public report can put out.
Thank
I do
you.
not think this bill is necessary. I believe us prosecutors are doing our jobs, and when we don't do our jobs, we lose our jobs.
Thank you. Mr. Kroll?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Stephen Kroll, the State's Attorney Coordinator for Maryland, Executive Director of the Maryland State's Attorneys Association. I'm here in opposition to House Bill 1035. On July the 10th, headed by Rich Gibson, State's Attorney for Howard County, the MSAA said the following: the Maryland State's Attorneys Association recommends that an independent police agency investigate police use of force instances that involve death or serious bodily injury. We also said the MSAA is opposed to any independent agency using any efforts in usurping our constitutional obligations in prosecuting any cases, including police use of force cases. The MSAA supports existing avenues of referral in legitimate conflict and police killing cases. Finally, I said it before at House Bill 670, I have some strong belief that any bill that gives the Attorney General any authority may very well be unconstitutional pursuant to Article 5, Section 3 of the Maryland State Constitution. And I'd ask for an Attorney General opinion by this committee to find out if it is constitutional or not. And for those reasons, I oppose and we oppose House Bill 1035. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Delegate Grammer has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A question, I guess, for both you gentlemen. I know a lot of people that are either currently in law enforcement or have been for many years. And I don't think there's necessarily a monolithic view towards police accountability. And frequently you'll hear some people say, like, look, we have guys that are giving us a bad name. And this idea of an independent police authority, it sounded like you had some problems with the way we would do it, or what if it was the state police? What if those were the bad guys? But you didn't say, what would be your suggestion for that? So for either of you, if the idea of, we're going to create a standard for a independent police authority, would your suggestion be to create a new one? Would it be state? Should it be the state police? Should we look towards maybe putting together cross-jurisdictional agreements? And I wanted to solicit your thoughts, please.
So, every police department has its own internal affairs unit, and they take their unit and their duties very seriously. In fact, officers are brought up on charges very, very often for things that everyone else in the world can get away with and not have any repercussions on their job. So I would suggest that the current system of internal affairs units and homicide unit investigating police use of force and police use of force causing death are thoroughly capable of handling this. And it's something that police chiefs take very, very seriously. And we think that that can continue. My concern with this independent agency is, number one, where are they going to be based? Number two, the investigators in this particular agency have to be very, very experienced. So you're talking about investigators who have 15, 20 years of experience, which means where are you going to get them? And then where are they going to be housed? And how do you set them up so that they can go to any part of the state, any day of the week, any time in the middle of the night, and actually get to the investigation where it's most important, and that is the 5 minutes after it happened. So I just think there are a lot of logistic problems here that would be almost impossible to solve.
So it's your opinion that the internal affairs is the appropriate place to deal with that, and it's been successful.
Well, yes. I mean, I think that it works very well. And again, if people don't like the decisions that I make, then, there's an election in 2022. I can tell you when we prosecuted James Laborde for the murder of Christopher Brown, more people were upset at me for doing that than if I had not done that. But that's what each of us get elected to do, is do our constitutional duty and do the right thing in every case that we do. And for that, whichever side we go on, we take criticism, but that's why we have this job, just like you all do. If you pass a bill that some of your constituents don't like, you just wake up and know you did the right thing. You don't create a new agency, a super legislature to say, we don't like the ones that you've been putting through lately.
Okay, I appreciate the answers.
Are there any other questions?
Madam Chair, my hand is up. I don't know if you can see it or.
No, I don't. I'm trying to find you. Okay, there you are. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's good to see you both on another week of judiciary. I just wanted to draw, and I don't know if this question is more for you, State's Attorney Schellenberger, rather than Mr. Kroll, but I think, you know, the issue that I'm having with the testimony that you all have provided is the politicizing of Black lives, right? So I understand that you're saying that if you make the wrong decision and if you don't prosecute, there's election. I just wonder what data you have. Like I'm very familiar with, you know, Baltimore, Prince George's, and Montgomery County. I just wonder how many state's attorneys around our state are primaried, how many state's attorneys, how many lawyers are per jurisdiction that are actually run for office. I mean, I think it's easy to say that the electorate will self-correct, but I'm just not, I would like to know if you all have any data, if that's part of your argument, on how often your state's attorneys are in competitive elections.
Honestly, I don't know that we collect that. It could be something that we could put together for you.
Yeah, I think so, because I think if your argument's that the public's going to be there, but, you know, let's say there's 5 counties that they haven't been primaried or, you know, haven't had an election, a primary or a general in 10 years, I don't really think that's accountability. And I think the other question that I wanted to ask you as well is, you know, I understand that you're saying, I just want to clarify your point. You don't like the proposal of an independent investigation of it, and you don't like whether the Attorney General or something else steps in. Is that correct?
That's correct, Delegate.
You would want everything to say, I know I just sound really slow, Madam Chair, I'm sorry, but I was like a real confused. So you just want everything to stay the same right now. That's what you're saying.
Yes, ma'am.
That's
So
not
you
what
don't think you need any help with investigation?
Mr. Kroll does agree there should be an independent investigation, and a number of folks on that work group did. So I'll let Mr. Kroll speak. I'm just talking for myself.
Okay.
The MSA believes there should be an independent investigation, but it should be with the state's attorneys. Independent investigation to investigate the case, but the state's attorneys prosecute the case.
Okay, and then my last question, I'll stop, Madam Chair. I see you. How many officers you all know have we convicted as a state in the last 10 years?
I honestly do not know that, but that's another thing we can probably look up.
Yeah, I think I would love if you all could provide some election data. And in the last 10 years, how many officers have there been guilties for in all the jurisdictions?
Is that for use of force only, or for any
those
crime?
state's attorneys brought forward? I think that would really help.
For use of force. Use of force.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Yep. We can get that information for you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Good to see you.
Thank you.
I don't see any other questions. Delegate Cox?
Thank you,
Anyone
Madam.
else has a question, please put your hand up.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. Just a real quick follow-up to Stephen Kroll's comment about wanting an independent commission within the state's attorneys. First, I'd heard of that, and so I just had a question. The Constitution seems to give the elected state's attorney the sole jurisdiction constitutionally, and would your suggestion of a commission create an unelected body that would then have authority over the jurisdiction in the Constitution of the state's attorney that's elected?
Delegate Cox, what I'm suggesting is we have an independent investigation to investigate the crime. The state's attorney who is elected by the people, will prosecute that case. My question is a constitutional argument of whether the Attorney General has any authority at all. And that's what we're asking for, the opinion from the Attorney General to find that out. But I'm not asking for anything that you had suggested, no.
Okay, no, I thought so. I just wanted to clarify. Thanks so much. That's good.
Delegate Bartlett?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have 2 questions for State's Attorney Schellenberger. One, do you agree that the existing jury instructions with respect to these types of cases is sufficient or insufficient?
Well, the jury instructions follow the law, and the law talks in terms of reasonable use of force based upon the circumstances. And that is what the law is, and that the jury has to consider all the circumstances and the factors that took place.
So do you agree do you agree if HB 670 had existed at the time of prosecution for some of the bills that some of the situations that you've had where you said you didn't win, do you think that the outcome would have been different because the jury would have been following House Bill 670 to determine use of force?
I don't think so, because just like Ms. Braveboy said, we actually hired expert witnesses who said what kind of force and escalation and de-escalation should be used. Both sides put those witnesses on the stand. So the jury had all those facts, and it wasn't all those factors. And then we're told about the reasonableness of the force under the circumstances. And that's what the law and jury instruction was. So I don't think putting it in law would have changed the outcome, because the jury was educated on all those things from both sides.
So actually, I said two questions. I just have one more quick follow-up, Madam Chair, if I may.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So with respect to what we see in videos of police shootings, and then the resulting lack of conviction that results from it. And if you're saying that changing the law that supports the jury instructions would not make a difference, how do we get there where we all can see a police shooting, yet there is no conviction?
I think we continue to educate, train, supervise, and instruct our officers in the proper use of force. And unfortunately, these decisions are often made in a split seconds. But I believe every police agency in this state spends a great deal of time trying to train their officers in how to deal with these situations. Now, you obviously have the right to change the law. I'm not exactly sure how we would change it that would make a difference.
Thank you for your response.
Yes, ma'am.
Delegate Arakan.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. Good to see you both here today. I just have a quick question. So aside from Baltimore City and Prince George's County, who both have this sort of set up independent agency within their state's attorneys is there any other counties or jurisdictions that have a similar setup where they've got their own investigators?
I don't believe so. You know, Prince George's County and Baltimore City have way more prosecutors and people than I do, even though I am the third largest jurisdiction in the state. You know, that they have way more prosecutors than either one of us. Now, you did hear about the situation where Montgomery County and Howard County trade cases. I have not been able to figure out how to do that because my jurisdiction is so big. So I believe that those two are the only ones that have their own special unit. If somebody wants to give me the money to hire 3 more people.
I was just going to say that. Are we squeezing you for money? Is that what's happening?
I would be happy to do it. Not to mention the fact that you're giving me 90 more seconds of body camera film. Oh, that was last week. So,
that was last week. Hey, come on now. That was last week. Come on.
That was last week. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's a great idea. I wish I had the bodies.
Okay, thank you very much.
Delegate, I can just tell you, Anne Arundel County is exploring it at this time, just to let you know, and other jurisdictions are exploring their own units at this time. But as Mr. Schellenberger said, it's a fiscal problem for a lot of people, but other jurisdictions are now exploring the idea.
So maybe state money in that direction may help alleviate some of the difficulty some of these jurisdictions are going through.
But remember, that would be on top of Vice Chair Atterbury's request for the $5 million to pay for those investigators. So, I mean, now we're starting to add up.
Yeah.
So I have final follow-up questions, and one, based on what's been said, to follow up on Delegate Arakan's question, what's happening with Howard and Montgomery County is not, in fact, working out so well because of the different size of the jurisdictions. So I don't know that that's necessarily a model. to follow. So Mr. Schellenberger, you mentioned, you said something to the effect of, we're presuming that based off of HB 670 and my bill that would correlate with that, that everyone's presuming that the state troopers would be used. And you alluded to, you know, how in the middle of the night is a state trooper from, you know, Central Maryland going to run out to the shore or what have you, kind of alluding to the fact that it would be difficult for the troopers to run around everywhere. But isn't it true that there are 23 different trooper barracks located in every jurisdiction? The only one that there isn't one is in the city, which certainly there are barracks in Baltimore County and Howard County, and where they could get to the city pretty quickly.
Madam Vice Chair, you're absolutely correct. But remember what those troopers are trained basically to do in certain jurisdictions. In Baltimore County, they basically handle law enforcement traffic violations on the interstate.
Right, but with all due respect, with this sweeping reform that we're doing, they would be trained to investigate deadly use of force and serious bodily injury.
I understand. As long as you have specially trained people in each jurisdiction, then that would probably cut down on the problem that I was expressing.
My other question, it's not necessarily a question, it's more of a comment. Mr. Kroll, you alluded to the fact, well, both of you did, that the state's attorneys are elected, but the AG is elected as well. So if people don't like what he or she is doing, then they could be voted out of office as well, quite frankly.
That's correct.
I still worry about the constitutional implications that I think we need to investigate. And just to follow up on Delegate Eric Hand, Wycomico County does have a special unit. I forgot to mention Wycomico County. I do worry about the constitutional issue, Vice Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. And that concludes the testimony on House Bill 1035. Now we are going to go out of order, as the chair mentioned, and we are going to move to Delegate Wells with House Bill 1027. And after you, I believe the mayor is being let in.
Great. Thank you. So good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. On behalf of the Mayor of Baltimore City, or excuse me, for the record, I am Delegate Melissa Wells, and I'm standing before you on behalf of the Mayor of Baltimore City. I've introduced HB 1027, which would establish local control for the Baltimore Police Department from the state to the city. This bill has been years in the making for the residents and leaders of Baltimore City. It plays a key role in reimagining policing and transforming the BPD. And while the city is making strides under the consent decree, more can be done if the city is given the ability to make innovative community-based changes through the local elected body. Some of you may be familiar with this issue. I know it's come before this committee, and I know that this was a topic that was raised in the police accountability work group. The House has heard and favorably passed similar bills transferring control of the Baltimore Police Department in the past. I hope that you give the same consideration and deference to this bill and the work of the mayor and his partners that they are putting into successfully refining the transfer and local control process for the city. I urge a favorable report and will now turn it over to Mayor Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Welcome to the Judiciary.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's great. It's good to be back. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I am Mayor Brandon Scott here in support of House Bill 1027. I want to thank our Delegate Wells, for introducing this piece of legislation. This is not the first time that I've been before your committee speaking on this issue, and this is a top priority of my administration. Local control of BPD is about police accountability, it's about representative democracy, and it's about racial justice. As you know, the city is the only jurisdiction in Maryland that does not directly oversee its police department. All other Marylanders can do this through their local councils and executive offices. This bill will put the city in the same posture. I have led on the advocacy on this issue for a decade now. We are living in a moment where we have the opportunity to make real change in a new way. Local control paired with the statewide police reform efforts that you are considering will go a long way to a meaningful transformation. The ability to set policies and provide oversight locally will enable us to truly transform the BPD and fulfill our consent decree requirements. I understand that state legislators have concerns about this change, and such concerns have hindered passage of this bill throughout the years. We have heard those concerns and hope changes to the bill will help address and alleviate those concerns. To address process concerns, the bill will establish an advisory council of key stakeholders. Many of the advocates we've been working with throughout the years to guide and oversee the transition. To address liability concerns, the bill clearly states BPD will be considered an agency of the state for all actions, omissions, or events that occur prior to the date of transfer, and will be considered an agency of the city for the same considerations after the transfer. To ensure that residents have a voice in the matter, the transfer of control is contingent on the passage of an amendment to the Baltimore City Charter and its ratification by the voters of Baltimore. The steps provided in this bill afford the state, BPD, city government, the city delegation members, and stakeholders the necessary time and process for guaranteeing the transfer occurs with forethought and precision. To ensure we put forward the best bill possible, we are working with a coalition of stakeholders to improve what is before you, with increasing calls for police transparency and accountability. Now more than ever, Baltimore City must regain the authority to oversee its police department. We look forward to working with the committee and our partners to make that a successful reality. And for those reasons, I urge a favorable report on House Bill 1027. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Next, James Shea. You will have 2 minutes. Once you unmute yourself.
Good afternoon, Madam Vice Chair and members of the committee. I am City Solicitor Jim Shea, and I'm here in support of House Bill 1027. I will address whether or not a change of the Baltimore Police Department to a city agency would result in increased liability on the part of the city. It is my opinion that if the department became a city agency, there would be no meaningful increase in liability on suits against the Baltimore Police Department. And that's for several reasons. The liability is visited both in federal and state court. In the state court, there are tort causes of action that can be brought. And in federal court, of course, there are Section 1983 actions. In both cases, Baltimore City already pays for the judgments rendered against Baltimore police officers. That's because, notwithstanding whatever immunities that might exist, a suit directly against the individual officers has been and will always be available to plaintiffs. And the situation today is, and it will remain, that Baltimore City pays for adverse judgments against its individual police officers. In state tort cases, it's because of the Local Government Tort Claims Act. And in federal cases, it's because of the collective bargaining agreement between the city and police officers. The law is very clear. There can be only one recovery. So if the city pays indirectly for the police officers, there can be no further liability for the city, whatever agency it's said to be part of. Secondly, in the federal courts and the federal litigation, even if the collective bargaining agreement were changed, the situation would not improve. Under the 11th Amendment, states are accorded immunity from Section 1983 suits. The courts have said that only occurs for an agency if it is, in fact, an arm of the state. And our federal court has now twice said that the Baltimore City Police Department, whatever it is nominally, agency of the state or the city, it is not an arm of the state.
Mr. Shea, can you wrap up, please?
Yes. So that also is not available. It is unlikely that that will be appealed. And if it's appealed, it's unlikely that the city would prevail under Section 1983 lawsuit. So for those reasons, I urge a favorable report on House Bill 1027.
Thank you. Carrie Hansel, you will have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. My name is Kerry Hansel. It's an honor to be here today. I'm present today as the chair of the Civil Rights section of the Maryland Association for Justice. As many of you know, we are the largest group of civil rights lawyers in the state. I'm also a Baltimore resident and a 20-year Baltimore civil rights lawyer. So it's an honor to join my mayor and my city solicitor, whose service I thank them for, in support of this bill. This is a critical change in Maryland law because my clients, hundreds of whom are victims of police misconduct and civil rights violation, ought to have the right to, in effect, enjoy home rule, for their vote to mean something, for their mayor to have the full authority that they have trusted Mayor Scott with, to make the difference that he was elected to make, and that my clients believe he will make if given that authority under this new bill. So this is certainly a bill we support for local control. We also support this bill because Baltimore City is the only city in Maryland for which civil rights victims do not have the choice between federal or state court. This would permit that choice. I agree with my city solicitor that it is not about a money difference, but there are important procedural differences between state and federal court. One or the other is more appropriate for certain cases. And in every single case in Maryland of a claim against a city, those cases can be brought either in state or federal court. And my clients simply want the same justice here in Baltimore that can be provided everywhere else. And we also want our elected leaders to have the full control of the police force so that they can make the change. We know they will. And so with support from my mayor and my city solicitor, thank you for considering this bill, and we urge a favorable report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I do see two questions, and just to let the committee know, there are 7 people after this signed up favorable with amendments. So 3 questions. I'll go in order that I saw them. Delegate Arakan, then Delegates McComas and Cardin.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. Thank you all for being here. Good to see you all. I just have a question. So I understand the litigation aspect. What other aspects of police decision-making does the state currently hold that this would shift over to the mayor's office? I guess I don't have a good basis for what we're really changing besides the litigation piece.
Thank you, Delegate Wells. I'll take that question if you want me to. Thank you, Delegate, for your question. So, Delegate, I'll make it in the simplest form. You guys in the General Assembly had to pass a law that said that the police department would redistrict their districts every 10 years. You guys in the General Assembly had to pass a law that says our police commissioner contracts don't have to be 6 years. Nowhere else in the state of Maryland would local bills like that have to go to the General Assembly. For example, here in Baltimore, our police department doesn't have to, by law, we have body cameras. If that was to be law right now, you would have to pass it, and we could not do it here.
Interesting. Okay, I wasn't familiar with the sort of basic day-to-day stuff was controlled completely by. And so do all the bills generally go through the Baltimore City delegation? They get delegation approval and then they move to whatever appropriate committee, which is usually here, I guess?
Yes, ma'am. I spent many a days in this committee.
Well, welcome back. We have lots of fun here.
And just so
Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're welcome. The committee knows we have passed this legislation before. It's the Senate that's the problem. Delegate McComas.
Oops. Sorry about it. This is for Mr. Hansel. I think you indicated that that they have to make a choice if this bill passes, whether they go state or federal. And I wondered if you had some kind of a chart so we could kind of see how they don't have that choice now. Baltimore City being under the state control versus if they became their own sovereign entity. That would be really helpful to understand kind of what the decision making is involved in the decision.
So I can very briefly explain it. There's not a chart that I'm aware of that I can provide, but it is simply this. In other states, because they're not, I mean, in the case of other municipalities, other local governments, they're not considered state agencies. The state or a state agency has 11th Amendment immunity in federal court, which means that federal court is off the table for Baltimore City. There are important procedural differences between how cases are addressed in local courts, state courts versus in federal court. In Baltimore City, as the city solicitor said, it is not about caps or damages or money, because the city does pay judgments, whether they're state or federal, against their officers. So that is not the issue. But the issue is that civil rights victims, like every other victim of any type of misconduct that involves a federal question, ought to have the same choice that all of those other people have, and the same choice in Baltimore City that any other victim in any other city in our state or local government in our state has, which is to choose where to assert their claim, whether to assert it in federal court or in the state courts. The differences are largely procedural. There are things like, how much detail do you need in your complaint before you file? In Maryland, for instance, because of the limitations under the Maryland Public Information Act, we can get almost no information from police departments. And I know this body is looking at those changes, but we can get almost no information from police departments before we file, yet federal court requires more information. So not all cases can go to federal court, some have to go to state. In contrast, there are some advantages in particular cases in federal court with the types of relief. So for instance, the consent decree and other types of relief that are the federal court is better situated to deliver. So we as civil rights lawyers in every other municipality and local government in the state have a long and detailed conversation with our clients about which jurisdiction is more appropriate, and giving that option in our city in Baltimore would make a meaningful difference in people's ability to bring meaningful civil rights claims. So that was my concern. The more important issue is the one that Mayor Scott raised, which is local control, so that he can take the simple steps that any other mayor or county leader could take.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have Delegates Cardin, Williams, and then Watson. So Delegate Cardin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Mr. Mayor and Mr. Shea, but Mr. Mayor, if you want to address it as well. I'm wondering who is opposed. Is the administration opposed? Is anybody going to be opposed to this bill, and why? And you already answered the second part of my question, but I'm just also wondering if, Mr. Shea, if your transition from private work to public work has gone smoothly. I'm sure with your new boss, everything seems to be going very well.
I will just jump in. Thank you, Delegate, for your question, to say nobody from the city will be opposing this bill. None of the agencies, the police department isn't going to be in support of the bill as well. As the mayor have shown and told everyone, this is what we have to do because this is the best practice around the state and around the country.
In answer to my part, the transition's gone smooth as silk.
Delegate Williams.
Thank you. Delegate Cardin did a nice segue towards, I guess, kind of my question. I did notice that the Maryland FOP did submit a letter, I guess, in opposition of the bill. One of the things that they cite in their letter is a concern with no longer being entitled to sovereign immunity that is currently available to state agencies. And so I don't know if Mr. Mayor or Mr. Shea, if either one of you want to address that point that was raised by the Maryland FOP.
I'd be happy to, Mr. Mayor. There's no practical effect that the defense of sovereign immunity has on this situation. It means in a state tort case that you can't sue the Baltimore City Police Department directly, but you can sue the police officers. And if you get a judgment, Baltimore City will pay for it. So there's a difference, but not one with a distinction.
Thank you.
Delegate Watson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good to see you, Mayor Scott. Just a quick question. I was receiving some emails from some of my constituents, and the question is, why does this bill get implemented in 2025? Is there any reason why it couldn't be implemented January 1st, 2023, as some have suggested?
Yeah, so actually, thank you for that question, Delegate. This is something that we will be addressing with our amendments, just making sure this is when the bill was drafted about being able to get everything needed done with the work group and then get it from the work group onto the ballot and approved by the citizens of Baltimore, but we're going to be pushing for it to happen in that way, and we'll have amendments to that effect very shortly.
All right, thank you very much. Good to see you.
Are there any other questions for this panel? Seeing none, thank you all for being here. We have 7 folks that are signed up favorable with amendment that are coming in. Well, 6. 1 is an interpreter, so we'll let them come in.
Very shortly.
All right, thank you very much. Good to see you.
Are there any other questions for this panel? If you're coming in, please mute yourself. Thank you all for being here. Somebody needs to mute themselves if you're coming in. Okay, we'll just give it. Okay, so first, Toby Dietz, and you will have 2 minutes to testify.
Thank you very much. I'm Toby Dietz, Baltimore resident for almost 40 years, testifying on behalf of Jews United for Justice in support of HB 1027 with amendments that you just talked about to shorten the timeline to 2023 and to also to guarantee inclusion of community members on the advisory board, which is just a little bit top heavy now. And we understand that the bill sponsors, you've heard a little bit about that, support these amendments, and we're really thrilled to hear that. Just a second on the timeline. In particular, I think you could say that us Baltimoreans have already spoken. We voted for Brandon Scott, who ran on a platform featuring local control. Advocacy organizations strongly support it, and it really was a rallying cry earlier this summer. So I'd say let's go for that 2022 ballot because local control is really popular, and I think folks are going to be a little bit uneasy if we wait too long on this. And then just the basics, local control really does have special significance to us in Baltimore. If you think about it, the other statewide reforms, police reforms that we're advocating, what they do is clear away obstacles and set minimum standards for local jurisdictions, but it's the local governments that do the positive work of ensuring meaningful citizen accountability. And yet, of course, as we all know, here we are, only jurisdiction in Maryland that cannot use local laws to shape its police. And in truth, we feel just a teeny bit dissed down here. We want this to happen. I know you do too. But our special status also has real world impact. Other people have testified about redistricting. The mayor just mentioned body cameras, but there are lots of ways in which a city council empowered to make laws would really help us citizens on police reform, on making police reform really stick. So again, after 160 years, I think this change is overdue and that you agree. So we urge a favorable report on HB 1027 with amendments.
Thank you very much. Next, Reverend Kobe Little, and you will have 2 minutes. Reverend Little.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair. Am I online now?
Yep, we can see you and hear you. Go ahead.
Great, thank you. For the record, I'm Reverend Kobe Little. I represent the Maryland State Conference of the NAACP, where I serve as Vice President and Political Action Chair. I'm also President of the Baltimore NAACP, and we're here today to speak in favor of House Bill 1027, sponsored by Delegate Wells, which would return local control to the Baltimore Police Department to the city of Baltimore. We support this amendment we support this legislation with amendment. We'd like to see the timeline moved up such that this would appear on referendum by 2022 and allow for 2023 implementation. Likewise, we would like to see the community oversight task force and the Baltimore Civilian Review Board included as part of the community membership in the legislation. So with that, we offer our support and we thank Delegate Wells for sponsoring this legislation.
Thank you. Next, I will call Gabby Roque to translate for Ismenia Bolivar. And we normally give 2 minutes, but I'll allow you like flexibility, 3 minutes. We'll just see how it goes. But whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thank you. Ismenia, ¿ya estás lista?
Sí.
Ok, adelante.
Ok. Buenas tardes, presidente Kerpenger y miembros del comité.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee.
Mi nombre es Ismenia Bolívar, soy venezolana y llegué hace 2 años a la ciudad de Baltimore. Permanezco aquí donde lo considero mi hogar. En Venezuela ejercía la profesión de abogada por más de 20 años en la materia civil, particularmente orientada en la protección de la mujer, niños y adolescentes. Actualmente me encuentro en este país huyendo de la situación política, económica y humanitaria que atraviesa Venezuela. Soy voluntario de casa y tengo participación activa en la lucha por el control local de la ciudad y de todo Maryland.
My name is Ismenia Bolivar, and I am from Venezuela. I came to the city of Baltimore 2 years ago and consider it my home. In Venezuela, I worked as a volunteer for more than 20 years, focused on the protection of women, children, and adolescents. I'm in this country fleeing the political, economic, and humanitarian situation that destroys Venezuela. I volunteer with GASA to fight for police reform here in the city and all over Maryland.
Hemos estado luchando para derogar la Declaración de los Derechos de los Agentes del Orden y reformar la Ley de Información Pública de Maryland. Otra reforma crítica que necesitamos es que la ciudad de Baltimore tenga control sobre su propio departamento de policía. Sin el control local de nuestro departamento de policía, no podemos avanzar y realizar los cambios necesarios para reformar la policía.
We have been fighting to repeal the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights and reform the Maryland Public Information Act. Another critical reform we need is for Baltimore City to have control over its own police department. Without local control of our police department, we can't move forward to make the necessary changes we need to reform the police.
¿Por qué es que los legisladores que no responden a los residentes de la ciudad de Baltimore tienen el poder de controlar una de nuestras agencias municipales más financiadas? Los residentes de la ciudad de Baltimore necesitan el control del departamento de la policía como cualquier otro municipio de Maryland.
Why should legislators who don't answer to Baltimore City residents have the power to control one of our most funded city agencies? Baltimore City residents need control of their police department like every other municipality of Maryland.
Muchos de mis hermanos y hermanas en el movimiento continúan siendo discriminados por la policía. No todos podemos levantar nuestras voces y recurrir o desplazarnos a Nápoles cada vez que necesitamos una reforma.
So many of my brothers and sisters in the movement continue to be targeted by the police. Not all of us have the privilege to be able to get up and fight and take our voices every day to Annapolis to demand this reform.
Por favor, aprueben este proyecto de ley 1027 de la Cámara y aprueben las enmiendas para que nuestra ciudad pueda tener el control local lo antes posible. 2025, el año 2025 es demasiado largo. No podemos esperar más. Muchas gracias.
Please pass the House Bill 1027 and pass the amendment so that our city can have local control as soon as possible. 2025 is too long to wait, and we can't wait any longer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kaylin Young, and you have 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair and members of the committee. My name is Kaylin Young, the Director of Public Policy at the ACLU of Maryland. We are standing here in strong support with amendments of House Bill 1027 to finally set a pathway to restore local control of the Baltimore Police Department to the residents of Baltimore. This is one of the 5 reforms we are pushing for as part of the Maryland Coalition for Justice and Police Accountability. This is also a primary goal of the Campaign for Justice, Safety, and Jobs. Thank you to Delegate Wells for introducing this bill, and to my former boss and Mayor Brandon Scott for not hesitating to fulfill this campaign promise. Also want to thank Delegate Anderson for his previous 2017 introduction of House Bill 1504 on this very issue. As you know, the BPD has been a state agency since the Civil War. Additionally, until very recently, the state legislature has provided minimal oversight on the BPD. This has contributed to what the BPD monitor Ken Thompson referred to as a culture of corruption. Recall, he made this statement during the consent decree briefing before this committee in 2019. And in the same briefing, the then new commissioner, Mike Harrison, further stated, and I'm paraphrasing, a corrupt police force cannot sustainably reduce crime. You must first eliminate the crime before you can see sustained crime reduction. Local control allows for the city council to provide the necessary oversight that it has been doing, but now with teeth, to hold the department accountable. The Community Oversight Task Force said that local control was needed for full implementation of the consent decree. A reminder that this committee and the full House, both Democrats and Republicans, unanimously supported and passed local control in 2019. The policing work group also further recommended this change, and even Senator West, a Republican, this year has introduced a bill to make this change. Local control is about racial justice, police accountability, representative democracy, and self-determination for the people of Baltimore. Implementing local control and ensuring a robust community participation is essential for building bridges of trust between this administration, Baltimore's Black communities, and the city as a whole. We have worked with Mayor Scott on a set of amendments to expand the advisory board to include more community members, require that the advisory board complete its final report by May 2022, and move the charter amendment ballot question from the 2024 election to the 2022 election, and thus moving transfer of control from 2025 to 2023. And with that, we urge a favorable report with amendments. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, let's go to question now from Delegate Arakan, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This question is for Reverend Little, if he's still on. I see his picture, but it's just a photo, so I'm not sure if he's able to hear us.
Yes, I'm still here.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Hi, Reverend. So I know we've heard this
Good
bill
afternoon.
before, and I had some concerns about it just because we've had a couple of mayoral administrations, as you know, that have had serious corruption issues themselves. So I was a little concerned about passing over the baton to them because of the issues previously stated. So I'm wondering why, and in Harford County, we have an election process. So our council and our county executive doesn't really make a lot of the policy around our police force. Our sheriff makes that. And then, we can fire him through the election if we don't like what he does. And additionally, a lot of that stuff still comes through the Harford County delegation. So I still get police bills almost every year about tweaking small things. So I'm wondering if the NAACP had an opinion on why they decided to go with this method, just sort of giving control to the mayor and the council versus an elected position, sort of like what some other counties have.
Well, I think there are a couple of things. There is a sheriff in Baltimore City, but that sheriff serves largely an administrative function in support of the courts. I think that Mr. Young from the ACLU laid out excellent arguments about self-determination and the democratic expression of the electorate of Baltimore City, and the power that typically has been and should be vested in the executive of the city, in this case, the mayor, as well as the city council having particular oversight. But really, the Baltimore City or the Baltimore Police Department is the only local law enforcement agency that has to look to the General Assembly and the Governor of Maryland for direction. And this is problematic on a number of levels. It feeds into and is part and participle of the structural inequity that we see, and some of the things that are designed to lessen the potency of Black voters in Maryland. And frankly, if we look back to the uprisings that took place in Baltimore around the murder of Freddie Gray, we saw a lot of blame coming from the governor at the state level for the actions of the police department, but not a whole lot of responsibility for the police department. And so, you know, in addition to all the arguments for this shift that have already been stated, you know, it's important for us to have some clear idea where the buck stops. And we believe that the buck should stop with the mayor of the city of Baltimore. Now, you know, as it relates to the larger question about police departments, I'm responding to the legislation that's in play now, but frankly, I believe that there should be much greater civilian oversight of all law enforcement agencies. And so I personally would be much more in favor of a police oversight board in Baltimore and across the state that ultimately vested, you know, akin to models that we've seen in Detroit and other places around the country, because I don't believe at the end of the day that police departments can effectively police themselves. I believe that sometimes the considerations for policing and the allocation of police assets and resources is politicized. But in the current environment that we're in, this is the best legislation that we have before us, and we support it with amendment for the reasons that have been laid out. So I appreciate your question, Delegate Ericon, and if I can answer something more specifically, I'm glad to do that. My apologies. I have been on a COVID call while I'm also doing the hearing. So
That's totally fine. Thank you so much, Reverend. I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Delegate Griffith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this question is for Mr. Young. And I voted for this last year. I intend to vote for it this year. I fully support local control. But in your testimony, you said something that's I'm having a hard time reconciling. You had mentioned in your testimony that the local control here would help root out corruption and create more accountability within law enforcement in Baltimore City, and I don't disagree. My question is, we heard about earlier where we're looking to centralize oversight statewide to root out corruption. You're saying that at local control would root out corruption. So I'm just trying to reconcile which is it. Is it local control is going to root out corruption, or is it centralizing another police force to oversight law enforcement will root out corruption?
I appreciate your question. I think that they're not mutually exclusive. The two that you just pointed out. First and foremost, every jurisdiction in the state has local control. And so, you know, the first thing is that allowing the city council to be able to provide the oversight that it has been trying to do would then allow for us to be able to deal with those problems at the local level. So for instance, when I'm talking about, when we look at recently, we had an overtime fraud scandal in the Baltimore Police Department that was uncovered as a consequence of some of the work that the city council does, but they weren't able to make any specific changes with regard to policy. So to your question, it's really about making sure that the appropriate body that's doing the actual work of looking into these different things can actually make the changes that they need to make. The rest of the oversight that we're referring to that's trying to root out corruption really has to do with the police discipline process, which is a larger issue. And as it relates to LEOBR in particular, that is a statewide issue. So whereas local control and the things that local control would correct are more local-based issues. Does that make sense?
I just want to follow up. So, I mean, even the Baltimore State's attorney today testified that local control is one of the issues we have, with, law enforcement across the state right now. So I'm just trying to square that up a little bit. I do appreciate your feedback. And again, I do intend to support this. I'm just trying to reconcile those two things we've heard today. So thank you.
All right, are there further questions for this panel? So the chair's understanding that Gabby Roque intended to testify herself as well as serve as a translator. For future reference, if we're going to do this in the future, that needs to be clearly stated in the sign up, please, so that we can adjust our time adequately for that. So we're going to give her 2 minutes to have her testimony, and if anybody has any questions for her, that'll be fine. But then we need to move to the opposition, and being that we're now on finishing hour 2 with 2 bills, maybe you need to get moving here a little bit. Ms. Roque, for minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairman Clippinger. Good afternoon, members of the committee. My name is Gabby Roque, and I am the Central Maryland lead organizer at CASA. I'm here today to urge a favorable report with amendments for HB 1027. CASA, as many of you know, is the largest immigrant services and advocacy group in Maryland. Every day I work with CASA members who are Black and Latinx immigrants in Baltimore City, and they have been very clear. Baltimore City Police Department needs to be an agency of the city. CASA members continue to be harassed, targeted, brutalized, and abused by police in Baltimore. Yet they are forced to travel to Annapolis and engage with legislators they don't know when pursuing justice. You've heard many CASA members testify before the committee about their interactions with the police. It must end. Like other members of the Maryland Coalition for Justice and Police Accountability, we strongly believe that a 2025 implementation date is too late for action that is already overdue. We ask the committee to move up the implementation date to 2023, adding local control to the 2022 ballot. We are also in strong support of the amendment to explicitly include community members in the makeup of the advisory board. The people must be part of the board if we want real transparency and accountability. We ask the committee to adopt these amendments and move forward with a favorable report for HB 1027. Thank you so much for your time.
Are there questions? Seeing none, thank you very much. We're now going to go to the opponents, and we'll hear from Bob Cherry, who's the sole person signed up in opposition. Seeing none, thank you very much. We're now going to Mr. Cherry needs to turn his Cherry. There we go. Bob Cherry is going to need to turn off his YouTube feed and keep up his Zoom feed, and then unmute himself. Cherry? Mr. Cherry, you need to unmute, and you need to take yourself off the YouTube stream. On the other hand, he appears to have taken himself off the Zoom. That also won't work. We'll give him a minute to come back. Here he comes. Bob Cherry, you can unmute now. And turn on your camera.
Is that good?
Now we're ready to go. 2 minutes, please.
So I apologize, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. First, thank you for allowing me here today, Mr. Chair. Like a lot of the speakers speaking before you, I'm also a city resident. I lived and voted in the city for 30 years now, and I'm a member of the Baltimore City Police Department going on 28 years, assigned to the homicide unit. And I say that because I think it's important that I get right into some of the things that the mayor said and the city solicitor that I find a little confusing and just outright that, you know, it's not what they're saying to you. It's a big misnomer. The first thing is the mayor talks about accountability. Moving the BPD under HB 1027 to the city doesn't change anything at all. The mayor and the city council, the mayor specifically, hires the police commissioner. The police commissioner in turn writes and puts into policy all of the rules and regulations that we have in the BPD. The police commissioner oversees our internal affairs division that roots out, you know, people talking about corruption or bad cops. I think it's important that the state realizes that this committee, that doesn't change anything. You know, Judge Bradar, who's been overseeing our consent decree for year 3 now, if Judge Bradar had concern with the fact that the state legislature still has some sort of control over the BPD, he would have mentioned it. So I wanted to get that off first. The other thing I want to touch upon is what your own Department of Legislative Services said. which is that there is going to be an increased potential liability when it comes to what will happen to us taxpayers when it comes to funding, because by transferring from state to local, the BPD will no longer have that sovereign immunity, or the city of Baltimore won't. And you will be opening us taxpayers up to a significant increase potentially. And again, that's all in there with the Department of Legislative Services. The final thing I want to say is with the mayor's bill that he asked Delegate Wells and in the Senate, Senator McCray to submit, it calls for an advisory board. In that advisory board, no one is even listed from the FOP, folks like myself and others who not only live in the city, but have been a member of this agency for 28 years. Hey, God bless Commissioner Harrison and what he and his administration are trying to do. I have worked and lived in the BPD for 28 years. And I will also tell you that when the mayor said that he couldn't enact body-worn cameras on us unless he went to you folks, that's not true. We actually implemented body-worn cameras ahead of every single police agency in the state of Maryland. And we did it because the commissioner can get that done on his or her own. Mr. Chair, thank you for that. The Maryland FOP and the city FOP ask you to give an unfavorable recommendation on HB 1027, at least as it's written right now.
Thank you very much. Are there questions for Mr. Cherry? All right, seeing none, we thank you very much for your testimony today.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And that concludes the testimony for House Bill 1027. We're going next to a bill that Delegate Buckle has asked Delegate Beitzel to handle on his behalf. And that's House Bill 1051, 1051. Delegate Buckle, are you ready to stand in for
Delegate Beitzel?
Beitzel, are you ready to stand in for Delegate Buckle?
Mr. Chairman Kleppinger and Vice Chair Atterbury, I'm ready and willing here to step in for Delegate Buckle. He had some other business he had to attend to. But
I understand. You go right ahead. Go right ahead for 3 minutes, please.
Okay, for the record, I'm Delegate Wendell Beitzel here to present House Bill 1051, Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, Identification Tags and Badges and Name Requirements. And at the outset, I would say that you're probably going to get off easy today because I don't talk near as much as Delegate Buckle. So the bill is a pretty simple bill, as I understand it. The bill prohibits a law enforcement officer from being required or requested to wear a personal identification tag or badge that indicates the law enforcement officer's first or last name when the law enforcement officer is on duty or acting in official capacity as a law enforcement officer. This bill I wrote, it rises from a concern that when an officer stops somebody or they're on the street or something, that they see the name of the officer, that they can easily trace who that officer is if they have some concerns about that officer, and could end up eventually perhaps tracing them to their place of living and harass them and their family or something if something comes up. That was kind of what I was told it was concerned. So it's a pretty simple bill. There's no cross-file. And so with that, I would ask that the committee give this bill favorable consideration.
Committee, with the understanding that Delegate Beitzel is not in fact the sponsor of this bill, is merely standing in because Delegate Buckle had an emergency. Be kind. The Vice Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you. I was just going to thank you. It's good to see you, Delegate Beitzel, for coming today. And tell Delegate Buckle I could see why he didn't want to show up today. That's all I have to say.
All right, thank you, Vice Chair.
With a reminder to be kind, Delegate Watson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am kind. Hello, Delegate Beitzel.
Good afternoon.
Just a quick question. I mean, have there been instances of something negative happening to police officers as a result of having their badge shown? And then my second part is, right now, if I wanted to search up a sitting judge's home of residence, I can't do it. As soon as they get elected, they're stricken. And if this is a concern, wouldn't something like that suffice to help protect judges the same way many attorneys are protected?
Yeah, I'm not sure of the answer to that question, but I can tell you that I will certainly an answer for you and get back with you, or have Delegate Buckle to contact you with that. And then and perhaps there's a delegate on your committee there, Delegate Cox, that might be able to provide some enlightenment on that respect. So yeah, I really don't know the answer to that. I do know if you're stopped by an officer and you're given a ticket or something, that they have to put their name on the ticket and everything. So if in fact they have really confronted you with something that ends up in arrest or citation, that you will know who that officer is.
Right. And I appreciate that, Delegate Bites. So I guess one of the concerns is if an individual is being harassed by a police, there's no way to, like you said, trace that back. There's no way to seek recourse because you don't know who that person was. In the military, we have our name stamped proudly across our chest.
Right.
You go to the grocery store, you know who's serving you food most times, at least the first names. So I don't see why this would be such an issue, but please pass my questions on to the good delegate.
I certainly will. Thank you.
Thank you.
Delegate McComas, do you have questions you wish Delegate Beitzel to pass on to Delegate Buckle?
Well, actually, Mr. Chair, I was going to ask you the question. In other words, if somebody hassled you, but you knew their badge number, you could call the sheriff's department or the police department and say, hey, who's this guy, and explain why you needed it. I mean, is that still possible? Because he's basically, I think that's what he's trying to do, is protect somebody to trace their home, because we actually had a situation in Harford County where a police officer was ambushed by, I think, some folks that were dealing drugs at his home. And I think there was a shootout. This was several years ago. So I was just wondering if, I think there are some protections, but if they hassle the person, that they would be able to find out, I would think, or through internal affairs. That's just my thought.
Yes, I think that I'm in I don't know that I'm necessarily comfortable answering a question about a bill that I didn't introduce. And I, at this point, I'm not going to express the committee's will one way or the other. That having been said, there are examples of, I can't say that when an officer makes a charge against someone, their badge number is necessarily put on whatever charging documents are on there, because they would have to be summoned to court. So they would have to reveal who they are in the charging process. If they are engaged in some kind of misconduct, there would need to be a way to identify that person. With absolutely no way of knowing, presuming that the delegate's intent is to somehow shield their information at their home address, I think that would be a slightly different way to do that. Sorry that your house is falling.
I know when I've seen summonses, it's been like that. They'll have maybe the person's name, badge number, and then they have the sheriff's department to serve for them to appear. So
I think that if you receive a speeding ticket in parts of the state of Maryland, in fact, there are some jurisdictions that if the officer did a good job, they'd like you to call in and leave a net message. I'm not kidding, with the county sheriff, but I don't know that I would have any personal knowledge of that. I'm not taking any more questions on this bill, and I don't think anyone else is either. Delegate Beitzel off the hook and say that is the end of the hearing on House Bill 1051. Thank you very much, Delegate Beitzel. And
thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We need to go to Cumberland and LaVale and make sure that he buys you the beverage of your choice. Thank you very much. Let's go now, mercifully perhaps, to Delegate Washington, who joins us from the rarefied air of the Ways and Means Committee. Which one would you like to do first? I think we were going to go with 953 first.
Yes, I believe so, Mr. Chairman.
That's fine. All right. So you're going to get 3 minutes.
Thanks, and I respectfully ask that my 3 minutes be given to Delegate Beitzel, who wants to who wants to take on our bills, my bill if he wants.
We're not doing this to Delegate Beitzel anymore. There's no more giving bills to Delegate. Delegate Beitzel did a wonderful job. It's not a knock on Delegate.
Good afternoon, colleagues
3 minutes.
of this committee. You guys, I want to think that you guys are one of the hardest working committees in the House, so I won't keep you long, although I have 2 bills with you today. House Bill 953 creates the position of a racial equity coordinator for every law enforcement agency in the state of Maryland that has an annual budget of over $50 million. As amended, I proposed some amendments to this committee already. This bill requires the coordinator to conduct a racial equity audit of the department's practices on hiring, internal discipline, use of force, traffic stops, arrest data, and training. The position will be responsible for analyzing and reviewing current practices utilizing industry standardized racial and gender equity tools, and will have the authority to review all police data. However, they'll be prohibited of sharing any personal data publicly. Each law enforcement agency will use the results of the audit to address any disparities found, and will report the results of their audit to the Governor's Office of Crime Prevention, Youth, and Victim Services by December 1st of every year. It's been well documented in this country's history that law enforcement agencies have a history of racial biases. Just for example, according to the Governor's Office of Crime Prevention, 50% of all traffic stops in the state of Maryland are for Black and Latinx drivers, while these groups only make up 37% of the state's population. Several large departments in our state have faced accusations of inequitable work environment and policing practices. I can go through that list if you want me to, but I will spare you because I know you all know this. But this bill just simply, my hope with this bill is to simply make sure that there's more racial equity within our policies and procedures that are implemented by the police departments around the state. So with that said, I urge a favorable report on this bill, and thank you all. And I direct all my questions to the chairman of the committee.
Is there a motion for an unfavorable? When did I get in the middle of all this? Right. There are questions that are going to be directed to you, Delegate Washington, not to me. He's the sole person to testify, so we will hear from him. Delegate Watson, please.
Thank you, Delegate Washington. Good to see you, my friend. Quick question. You mentioned the cap of 50 million or above. So how many counties does that actually impact in the state?
Delegate, we're researching that now. I'll give that back to you. I know that there's some hard with this position. It will cost each individualized, agency about $70,000 a year to hire this position, according to the estimates made by DLS. So I wanted to go as high as we possibly can to get all the major jurisdictions, but I'll get that number to you though.
All right, thank you.
Delegate Juanita Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hi, hello, Delegate Washington. How are you today? Good. Okay, so my question really has to deal with, if you could speak or expand a little bit on the role and if it would be sort of internal within the department or racial equity in policies and policing on the street and interaction with the community. Does it delve more into hiring, in that department? If you could expand a little bit kind of on the framework or how you envision it to be.
Well, no, thank you for that, Delegate Fisher. As you know, this is one of our recommendations that we made to the county executive during our work group at the county level. What I envision this position to review is the internal policies and procedures, as well as the external implications or external factors that are around the community and how they interact and engage with the community and how they do that. For instance, if they provide their name and number and badge to someone who is Black versus someone who is white, versus these types of things and how they interact with people is really important. So I foresee them to be able to look internally as well as externally. This position, we haven't stipulated in the law whether it will be an internal position within the police department oversaw by the chief, or it would be a position that's at the council or county executive level or a mayor's level. So I have not implicated, but that's something that the committee can take up as well.
Thank you.
Are there further questions? I mean this in the kindest possible way, and I am just being direct. So I think people could read something into this question. I don't mean that to be the case. I just need to be direct. Is there a place in the annotated code where racial equity is defined?
Is there a place in the annotated code where it's defined? Not according to the I don't think so. I'm not sure, but I'm sure this committee can come up with that if it's not.
It's not, at least the part of the public safety article that you're drafting to, it's not there. I'm not trying to make a bigger deal out of that. There is a discussion that is actually a much bigger question and to a greater extent. I don't know that it would be fatal, but I think that defining what the scope of that job would include is something that would need to be a little clearer in the bill. But
no, I don't disagree with that, Mr. Chairman. But I would just ask the committee to really, look, racial equity coordinators are not new in this country. They exist in other spaces. Baltimore City has a racial equity department, and they look at racial equity issues. Prince George's County Public School System has a racial equity coordinator, of which I brought a lot, of which, if you look at the amendments, I defined it based on the job description that the school developed. And I think it's something that we should actually figure out how we can do and how we can define in the code. So but thanks for the question.
No problem. Are there further questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for that. That concludes the testimony for House Bill 953. We'll go to House Bill 956. Now, there are people here to testify on this bill. We'll hear from all the people testifying in favor. That's Delegate Washington for 3 minutes, Cynthia Lee, Jonathan Carter, Rachel Gale, Justel Hanrahan, and Lane Cotter. We'll hear from all of them. Delegate will get 3 minutes. They'll each get 2. Then we'll on this bill. We'll hear from the 2 people who are listed as unfavorable. So with that, we will go ahead and hear from Delegate Washington for 3 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Delegate Washington here for the record. House Bill 956 is a familiar bill to everyone here on this committee, or most of you. I've introduced this bill 3 times before. This bill would build on the recent work done by the General Assembly to reform policing practices by establishing a use of force statute for our state. When a police officer shoots an individual, that officer's decision to use force or use deadly force should be carefully evaluated to ensure that it is an appropriate choice of action under the circumstances. Over the past couple of years, following the work of the Public Safety Work Group, the Maryland Police Training and Standard Commission improved its use of force evaluation process by issuing a set of best practices and standards for the use of force by law enforcement officers. Much of what is proposed in HB 956 comes from these regulations issued by the commission. I'm not gonna belabor this point. I'm not gonna belabor the point of the bill. I've introduced this bill several years in a row, and I'm glad that we're at the point right now where we can start to move a use of force law, a statute, establish one for the state. I know there's been many statistics put out there and everything else, but I just wanted to bring this bill again and allow my panelists to be able to explain the reasons why, or even answering any of the questions as well. And I know this bill isn't the perfect piece of legislation, but it is one that has elevated the conversation around the use of force statute being developed and established in the state of Maryland. So with that said, Mr. Chairman, I ask for a favorable report on this bill or any other bills like this. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for being able to speak on this bill.
Thank you very much, Delegate. Let's go ahead now to Cynthia Lee. This is going to be for 2 minutes, please. And there is Cynthia Lee. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Cynthia Lee, and I'm a professor of law at the George Washington University, where I've been teaching criminal law and procedure for 20 years. I'm here in support of HB 956. Until recently, DC, Maryland, and Virginia were 3 of less than a dozen jurisdictions without a use of force statute. Last July, DC enacted a use of force statute that largely mirrors a model statute I proposed in a 2018 law review article. Several key provisions from the DC statute are also in HB 956. Like HB 956, DC's use of force statute requires that the beliefs and actions of an officer who uses deadly force must be reasonable. It also requires that all other reasonably available options must have been exhausted before the officer uses deadly force. Additionally, it requires the jury to consider whether the officer engaged in de-escalation measures. Today, DC is not the only jurisdiction to do so. On July 31st, Connecticut became the first state in the nation to adopt these key provisions, and Virginia became the second state to do so in October. I hope Maryland will follow the lead of DC, Virginia, and Connecticut by passing HB 956. HB 956, like the use of force statutes in DC, Virginia, and Connecticut, requires the officer to have reasonably believed it was immediately necessary to use deadly force to protect the officer or another against the threat of death or serious bodily injury. It thus requires proportionality, immediacy, and necessity. It is true that this bill goes beyond what the Supreme Court requires in Section 1983 cases. All the Supreme Court requires is reasonableness balancing, and balancing in federal cases is conducted with a thumb on the scale in favor of the officer. State legislatures have the power and the authority to fashion their own rules regarding when police use of force is justified in state criminal prosecutions. For these reasons, I urge you to enact HB 956. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Professor Lee. We'll hear now from Jonathan Carter, please, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Delegate Washington and the members of the Judiciary Committee. My name is John Carter, and I'm testifying in support of HB 956. At first glance, I've been presumed to be a lot of things in my life, even by the well-intentioned. Folks likely see the archetype of a lawbreaker and not one of a law student when they look at me. Folks see someone who could be a threat to them and not a combat veteran of the war in Afghanistan. I know that you hear from the representatives of the public safety professionals on the ground, and I know they emphasize the limits of human performance. They emphasize the dynamics of a force encounter with all of the variables unknown, or they emphasize the hypervigilance required to keep themselves and the public safe. I fully understand that there are times when deadly force is called for, but what was required of me when I was a 19-year-old in the Army with just over a year of experience dealing with armed terrorists was that deadly force would only be used when it was reasonably necessary, and that standard of necessary was determined by those that we were accountable. It was very straightforward. That the service members who explicitly have a license to use deadly force have tighter use of force protocols with armed terrorists than law enforcement officers do with unarmed Black people in Maryland should not be allowed to continue. And for me and people that look like me, it is a matter of life and death. When I returned home from deployment as a Black man, there were times that I felt that the threat from law enforcement here in America was greater than the threat on patrol in Afghanistan. A favorable report on HB 956 is an essential step to ending that, and thank you.
All right, thank you. We'll hear now from Rachel Gale, please, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the Judiciary Committee. My name is Rachel Gale, and I'm a third-year law student at the George Washington University Law School in Washington, D.C. I'm here today to express my support for House Bill 956. Police officers pledge to protect and serve the people of Maryland. That population includes people who are subjected to police use of deadly force. The deadly force provisions before you recognize that there are situations where an officer is left with no choice but to use deadly force. HB 956 simply asks police officers to only use deadly force in those situations where there is no other option. Last summer, I spent months researching police use of deadly force throughout the United States. I read investigatory reports, I read legal cases. I watched body camera footage, and I reviewed news article after news article. In all this research, I found a common theme. Police officers can take small steps to avoid using deadly force. Those small steps save lives. This benefits both civilians and officers. With stronger limits on the use of deadly force, civilians avoid suffering unnecessary injuries, trauma, and even death. It also benefits police officers. Parameters for when deadly force can or should be used prevents officers from having to wrestle with wondering what they could have done differently and whether they made the right choice. Unlike a training manual, this legislation incentivizes officers to exhaust all other reasonable means before using deadly force. Importantly, HB 956 creates accountability. It provides consequences for officers who use deadly force in situations when other measures could have been taken. This will not unreasonably hinder officers from doing their jobs. Rather, it gives them greater guidance for how to do their jobs. The current legal standard for use of force does not give officers or civilians parameters for when deadly force can or should be used. HB 956 is the solution. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to Justel Hanrahan, please.
Good afternoon, delegates. My name is Justel Hanrahan, and I am a law student at the George Washington University, and I will be taking the Maryland bar exam in July. Thank you for giving me some time to speak on behalf of HB 956 today. I want to use my time to share a personal story with you. On December 10th, 2017, I received a call from my partner. He told me that his younger brother had died. Kyle had just turned 24. Over the next few days, we learned that Kyle had traveled to California, and while he was there, he had a severe mental health crisis. He was in an affluent neighborhood of San Diego, knocking on doors and asking for a knife so he could kill himself. When the police were inevitably called, he broke through the glass door of a nearby home. He grabbed a kitchen knife and put it to his throat. There were no bystanders, just Kyle and the two responding officers. The officers were equipped with tasers, with beanbag guns, and their sidearms. As Kyle approached them, one of the officers shot him 3 times with an AR-15. I actually watched the body camera footage for the first time to prepare this testimony. And he didn't die immediately. It took more than 7 minutes. Kyle was a wiry white kid from rural Connecticut. He was handsome, and he was funny, and he was loved. And 3,000 miles from home, in the middle of a suicidal episode, he was shot. He died slowly, surrounded only by the people who shot him. I will never forget the way that Kyle's mom screamed at his wake and threw herself onto his body. My partner, only 27 at the time, had to physically drag her off so they could close the casket and begin the service. The legislation at issue today will not prevent officers from doing their jobs or from using lethal force when it is necessary, but it will incentivize them to de-escalate before turning to deadly force. If the officers that responded to Kyle had used tasers or beanbag guns or called a mental health professional, maybe he would still be here today. Delegates, I ask you to think about what you would want the law to require if it was your child in crisis. I ask that you think of Kyle and his family when you decide whether we should require those we task with keeping us safe to use non-lethal options before turning to lethal force. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll go now to Lane Cotter, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the Judiciary Committee. My name is Lane Cotter. I'm here to offer legal analysis in support of HB 956 based on my experiences as a civil litigation attorney, former editor of the Harvard Civil Rights Civil Liberties Law Review, and grandson of a New York City police officer. Interests and society. Section D of this bill in particular outlines just 2 factors that the trier of fact must consider as part of the totality of the circumstances when assessing whether an officer's beliefs and actions were reasonable in a given case. First, HB 956 instructs the jury to consider whether the officer engaged in de-escalation measures. This ensures that the jury considers de-escalation when it might not think to do so on its own. The law, however, does not direct the jury to find an officer either guilty or not guilty. It recognizes that each case will present different facts and circumstances and leaves the ultimate decision in the hands of the jurors. Many police chiefs even recognize that de-escalation training is an important way to reduce the number of bad shootings, which is why an increased number of police departments, including the Baltimore Police Department, include de-escalation in their internal police regulations. But having a de-escalation in an internal police regulation is not the same as having it in the law, because a violation of the police policy is not enforceable by court or jury or society. HB 956 also requires the jury to consider whether the conduct of the officer increases the risk of a deadly confrontation. In broadening the time frame that the law considers relevant when assessing the reasonableness of an officer's use of deadly force, HB 956 seeks to influence police behavior before the moment in time when the officer is fearing for his or her life and about to pull the trigger. Consider, for example, an officer who breaks into a home without a warrant and encounters an armed homeowner. If the officer were to shoot and kill the homeowner and later claim that he or she acted justifiably, whether the jury looks at the moment in time right before the shooting or expands its time frame to consider the officer's conduct prior to that moment could make a pivotal difference. If we focus only on the moment before the shooting, the officer's act of shooting may appear reasonable because at that moment, he or she was threatened with death or severe bodily injury. But if we step back and we expand the time frame, we can see that the officer's conduct of breaking into the home without a warrant increased the risk of deadly confrontation, and thus the use of deadly force was less reasonable. In order to achieve the most just result, it is important for the jury to be able to consider the full facts and circumstances of the situation. And for that reason, I urge you to support HB 956. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Are there questions for this panel? Seeing none, we thank you all very much for your testimony here today. And we will move on to the opponents of the legislation, going to Karen Kruger and Scott Schellenberger. So we'll hear from them now for 2 minutes each, and they are being allowed into the Zoom call presently. Karen Kruger.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm here. I'm not sure why my camera's not engaged.
If you could try and turn on your camera, we'd appreciate it. We require that if we, well, looks like you're trying. There we go. Okay.
Yes.
2 minutes. 2 minutes, please.
Oh, I'm up. I thank you.
You are up.
My name is Karen Kruger. I'm the General Counsel to the Maryland Chiefs of Police Association, and also today representing the Maryland Sheriff's Association. I'm an attorney that's practiced in this area of the law for over 25 years. I'm also a recent graduate of the Force Science Institute, which is an institute that studies police use of force using scientific methods and experimentation. The flaw with this bill and others like it is the failure to take into account the limits of human performance and the dynamics of a force situation. Because the human being is involved in each of these cases, and I mean both the officer and the subject, there are certain physiological aspects that need to be considered before you regulate this conduct of police officers. So a very quick 1-minute anatomy lesson. When you are faced with a threat, you're probably familiar with the fight or flight syndrome, which is a physiological hormonal response that the body and the brain makes to prepare for danger. A police officer is always reacting to the actions of a subject. So that starts to trigger the fight or flight response. The officer has to first see what's happening, have an understanding of what's happening. The brain, it's really the primitive part of the brain, pardon me, that goes through an exercise of trying to identify the threat, if it is in fact a threat. Then a decision has to be made how to respond, and then a neural message is sent from the brain to, usually in our case, a hand to use some sort of weapon against the suspect. But none of this can happen while you're at the same time going through a cognitive checklist of de-escalation and how to avoid confrontation. It's just not physiologically possible. Once the neural message is sent from the brain to the hand to, for instance, deploy a taser, that message can't be stopped. So
Ms. Kruger,
regardless of,
Ms. Kruger, we'll need you to wrap up, please.
okay, thank you, sir. I just want you to bear in mind that the police officer is a human being, is facing difficult circumstances, and there are physiological limitations. I'd be happy to provide more information about that on another occasion.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much. Scott Schellenberger for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee. Scott Schellenberger, State's Attorney for Baltimore County. So once again, here we are trying to legislate 2 o'clock in the morning, split-second decisions in a bill. And we have acknowledged through some of the other legislation that we've made great strides in this area, both in our de-escalation training, in our use of force training, in our policies and procedures at the Maryland Training Commission. The problem when you put it into law is that if there are changes that need to be made, either in light of some of the new psychological things that are learned or social studies that are learned, then we have to wait a year to make these changes. I don't believe that we can legislate what an officer does in a split-second decision. The other thing that I think, and I think therefore leaving it to the commission and making recommendations to police agencies is the much better way to go. The other thing that I'm looking at is, the limits on the use of force. It talks about they can use force to effectuate an arrest, prevent an escape, obtain a compliance with a lawful order. Well, what if you're standing between two individuals ready to fight and all you do is put your hands up and push out? Is that included in this list? If I have forgotten to order them to step back and get away from each other? You can't legislate every one of these things and expect officers to be able to do it. They also have a list of 8 different de-escalation techniques. How long does the officer have to go through that list of 8 while they're standing there confronted by force? I just feel like this is an area that is best handled by the case law and by the Maryland Commission as they make policy and do training.
Thank you very much. There are questions for this panel. Delegate McComas to begin, then Delegate Bartlett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it. This is for Ms. Kruger. You were starting to explain that the training is that they are almost do things very quickly. Let's say as far as getting the gun out of the holster and things like that, and that it's almost like a what do I want to say? Like a response, like a trained response. That's not the word I want to say. But the problem is when they have to go through the cognitive checklist, that there's a delay. I just wish you could kind of explain how the two work, because one is sort of on instinct or reflex, and the other one is kind of more cognitive, intellectual front lobe stuff.
Yes, thank you, Delegate McComas. There is a distinction there between the cognitive brain and what is referred to as the more primitive brain. And the more primitive brain is what's at work when you're in danger, and does rely more on the instinctive trained responses. The cognitive brain, as Mr. Schellenberger just referred to, having to go through a checklist before saving your own life, is just too much to ask of any human being. So that we need to respect what is really reasonable for the officer at the moment force was used. That's what the current law is. And the reason the law is that is because it takes into account that an officer has limited, although skilled, but still limited physiological capabilities at that moment in time.
Delegate Bartlett, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Schellenberger, I'm a little confused because I thought this bill would take care of the jury instructions in the sense that it is saying, look before, look at the officers, et cetera, things that the jury cannot take into account necessarily now. So do you still feel that this, I understand what you're saying about the training, but you still feel that this bill would not provide some jury instructions in which you could get a conviction where there is a a video and we see the police officer, fire a firearm and kill someone?
Well, Delegate, I do think the jury instruction is already given, and those jury instructions are adapted to the facts of that particular case. My concern is, you're in a jury trial, and now all of a sudden the law says, here are the 8 things that the officer has to consider. And I can hear the cross-examination. So did you think about taking cover? How long did you think about that? Did you think about waiting for backup? Did you call for backup? And then they go through each one of these things in a statute that under the facts and circumstances of the case might not apply. Now, candidly, he's going to have his own lawyer who's going to argue why those factors didn't apply. But once they're in a statute, I think it just gives it that much more force. And it's possible that the officer couldn't have done some of those things. It just makes it more complicated. Candidly, now they do bring out the Maryland Training Commission standards, and they say, here are standards, here's what we train. But my problem is putting it in law and legislation. It makes it very difficult to make changes if we have to make changes.
Are there further questions for the panel? Seeing none, we thank you all very much. That concludes the testimony for House Bill 956. And we thank Delegate Washington for being here today. We're still looking for Delegate Keith Haynes. Haven't had luck there yet, so we're going to go ahead to the Charles County delegation. I believe that's Delegate Davis, who is going to be presenting on House Bill 1024. It'll be Delegate Davis for 3 minutes, and then Ongisa, I should say, Ichile McKenzie, Little, then Ruben Collins, and Zain Shirazi from the Office of the Public Defender. So the delegate will get 3 minutes. Everybody else will get 2.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, and colleagues on the Judiciary Committee. For the record, my name is Deborah Davis. I'm delegate from Charles County District 28. I am pleased to bring before you a local bill, and I'm proud to say that with your support and the passage of 1024, House Bill 1024, Charles County is going to join several other counties with a Citizens Complaint Oversight Board. And with that, I'll let the experts talk to you. I just briefly like to ask for a favorable report for House Bill 1024. Thank you.
Let's go next to Ms. McKenzie, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Angasa Ichile McKenzie, and I'm representing Southern Marylanders for Racial Equality. Clearly, trust between the community and police officers has broken down. Police usually investigate and decide what, if any, consequences fellow officers get in cases of police misconduct. With police policing the police, fewer than 1 in every 12 complaints of misconduct result in any disciplinary action. Communities need a permanent, effective way to ensure police officers are held accountable for police violence. I met a 20-something Black Charles County resident at a rally we organized at the end of May after the murder of George Floyd. He'd been stopped, according to him, 20 separate times by sheriffs in the 5 years he's lived in the county. Not actually arrested, usually on his way to work, just harassed over and over. How can that man get relief? School resource officers in Charles County are arresting Black children as young as 11 years old at a rate of 88% to their white counterparts, just for basic school misbehavior. Nothing has been done to stop this, despite outcry from the public. A Black teenager represented by our public defender's office gave me permission to share his story. He was stabbed in an altercation. Sheriffs were called, and he was compliant, but obviously very upset. Somehow, this young man was threatened with a police dog. This young man was grabbed by the hair and thrown into a police vehicle. And when his mother came and asked why he was being arrested, she was told, quote, he's going to jail, and wasn't allowed to talk to him. When the sheriff was asked why he was being arrested for nothing, the officer in the audio replied to the youth for, quote, running your mouth. The sheriff even acknowledges in the audio that the boy may need EMS services because, as he mockingly referred, to the young man's stabbing injury, quote, looks like you've got a scratch. The sheriffs were charging him with the same bogus charges that police often give when they're harassing our youth: resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, failure to obey. Now remember, he is the victim in this. He was a victim of the stabbing. So those charges were dropped when the witness confirmed that he was the victim. His mother, however, was never told about the process for filing a complaint against the officers until the public defender's office sent her the forms, which were cumbersome and very time restricted. We believe this harassment is due to a lack of oversight by the public. Southern Marylanders for Racial Equality asked our county delegation to create a civilian review board that's effective, fair, and empowered to improve outcomes for our community. An article in Police Quarterly in 2015 stated that civilian review boards were 78% more likely to sustain a complaint against a police
Ms. McKenzie, if you would please wrap up your testimony.
Thank you, wrapping up. Data also suggests the majority of violations are committed repeatedly by the same officers. So a civilian review board could be instrumental in weeding out those officers and changing the culture. We also agree with the amendments that will be proposed by the Public Defender's Office today. HB 1024 gives voice to the people and ensures accountability for law enforcement who are here to protect us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to go now to Reverend Little. Reverend Kobe Little, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I'm Reverend Kobe Little, representing the Maryland State Conference of the NAACP. I want to thank Delegate Deborah Davis for sponsoring this important legislation. The Maryland State Conference of the NAACP stands in full support of this legislation, and we stand shoulder to shoulder with our local branch and our local branch leadership in the person of President Diotha Sweat. Civilian oversight is an important component of maintaining democracy in the face of the extreme powers that law enforcement officers by necessity are equipped with. We think it's only appropriate, given what has come to light over the last 12 months, that each jurisdiction, and in this specific case, Charles County, would have an oversight function that would include civilians. So members of the committee, we do urge strongly that you would send this piece of legislation to the full House with a favorable report. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go with Zain Shirazi.
Thank you. There is no more powerful actor in a community than its police officers, who have the power to act as judge, jury, and executioner in the blink of an eye. With that great power must come great oversight. And yet, with that immense power that the police have in Charles County, they face no real oversight that the community can have faith in. My name is Zain Shirazi. I've been a public defender in Charles County for the last 5 years plus. My colleagues and I have been witnesses to far too many in our medium-sized jurisdiction with a leader among Maryland law enforcement. Police abuse is widespread, undisclosed, and unaddressed. And if I had more time, I could present some stories about that. Have no doubt, a civilian review board in Charles County is absolutely necessary and absolutely the right step. A civilian review board done right can increase public trust in the police. That's not only good for the community, that's good for the police. HB 1024 gets so much right. It adopts an investigatory model. It enables the board to investigate not just specific complaints, but also patterns of misconduct. It allows complaints to come from many different places. It requires a response from law enforcement as to whether or not they're going to follow the board's recommendation, and if not, why not? And this legislation gives the board teeth by penalizing those who knowingly fail to cooperate with this investigation so that the community knows that this thing is for real. These are just some of the many things this legislation gets right. And if we had to choose between two binary options to either support the legislation or not, we would choose to support it as is in a heartbeat. But we do want to take this time to propose three minor amendments. First, the Civilian Review Board will be the only real opportunity for civilians to have oversight of their police officers. So there shouldn't be any spots on the board specially reserved for the police. Second, it should be optional for the complainant to appear for a hearing before the board. Currently, the language in HB 1024 is that the complainant shall appear at the hearing. While there may be some wiggle room in how to interpret this provision when read in context, the current wording leaves complaints susceptible to dismissal simply because the complainants do not appear at hearings. Our concern is that too many valid complaints that can be resolved without the complainant may end up being dismissed because the complainant doesn't appear if the language remains as it does. We suggest using the word may to allow a complainant to appear and to continue using the word shall to require an officer's presence. Finally, 2 years removed from law enforcement is too short a time period for the board's investigators. We suggest that the time period be 10 years at the very least. The investigators should not have worked as law enforcement in Charles County in the last 10 years. We want to thank you for the opportunity to speak on behalf of this legislation. We want to thank everybody who's worked hard on this legislation. We believe it's necessary and very important.
Thank you very much. I believe that there is, there isn't it? There he is, Reuben Collins. We will hear from Reuben Collins. Weren't sure that he was going to make through. Reuben Collins for 2 minutes. Mr. Collins.
Good afternoon, and how are you, Chairman?
Very well.
Again, my name is Reuben Collins, and as the Commissioner President in Charles County, I respectfully request a favorable action on HB 1024 to establish a Charles County Citizens Complaint Oversight Board. Law enforcement oversight and accountability is a hotly debated national topic, particularly in light of several highly publicized events in recent months and years. Charles County has taken this moment as an opportunity to examine how we might make improvements in the area of public safety and police accountability in our community. We are committed to ensuring proper protocols and processes are in place to facilitate fair and just disposition of citizen complaints against our local law enforcement. We view this legislation as a necessary tool to ensure police accountability in our community. It is the opinion of the Charles County Commissioners that an independent oversight board of law enforcement misconduct investigations will improve the complaint process by providing mechanisms and locations outside of law enforcement facilities to accept complaints and provide non-police driven feedback on the status and outcomes, thereby making it more inclusive and transparent. The Citizen Complaint Oversight Board will provide an independent voice to hold our law enforcement accountable. We believe that all our community stakeholders have a shared desire for safer communities and working partnerships across interested groups. This legislation takes us one step closer to the kind of impartial and credible oversight needed in our community to foster and maintain trust in our local law enforcement. Charles County believes that an oversight board of this nature will deter the kind of actions by law enforcement that will result in citizen complaints, in addition to equipping the board to provide meaningful action should those complaints arise. So once again, we're asking Mr. Chairman to please provide a favorable report for HB 1024. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Commissioner. I'm asking if there are questions to the panel very quickly to Delegate Deborah Davis. Is there a letter from the Charles County delegation yet? Was this approved by the Charles County delegation?
It was unanimously approved by the Charles County delegation.
Okay.
The letter's not in the file. I'll make sure it is.
Okay, that's fine. And just to be clear, it was approved by the delegation with amendments or without amendments?
Without amendments, because this is the first we've heard of these amendments, but we'll make this. That's not a problem.
Okay, and I just wanted to be clear as to how it left the Charles County delegation. That's fine. Are there any further questions for the panel? All right, seeing none, thank you very much. That concludes the testimony on House Bill 1024. Still no sign of Delegate Haynes. So we're going to go to Delegate Wilkins, who I can see is in the Zoom and is coming on now. We have quite a few witnesses here for Delegate Wilkins' bill and several in opposition. So we're going to go ahead and do this. This legislation, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Okay, I see 14 plus the delegate. We'll just do them in groups of 5 and that'll be fine. we'll do three at a time, or five at a time, three panels. So Delegate Wilkins, you're going to get 3 minutes. Then we'll go to Marion Gray Hopkins, Tiana Boardman, Samuel Shapiro, Neil Franklin, and Michael Winkleman. We'll go through those. Yeah, well, that'll be a total of 6, but that's fine. Those 6, delegate will get 3 minutes. Everybody else will get 2. And with that, Delegate Wilkins, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Greetings, Madam Vice Chair, and hi, everyone on the committee. Good to see you. For the record, I am Delegate Janelle Wilkins, presenting HB 1049, the Police Qualified Immunity and Accountability Act. Every time I speak on the issue of policing, I lift up the names of Emmanuel Okotuga, Robert White, and Fanon Berhe. They are 3 Black men unjustly killed by Montgomery County Police in my district in the last few years. These 3 Black men should still be alive today, and I've grieved with their families, their neighbors, and friends as we continue to seek justice. We have the opportunity and must seize this moment to end the murder of Black people at the hands of police. I'm proud that this committee and the policing work group has been carefully considering the long overdue overhaul of policing in our state with robust legislation that's being considered. And I'm before you today to urge that ending police immunity is an essential part of this reform. In Maryland, officers are able to claim immunity from accountability for their actions, even if these actions are reckless and endanger, harm, or kill. Millions of taxpayer dollars have been paid out to victims of police conduct, yet in most circumstances, officers don't face any civil liability or consequences of misconduct. The ability of officers to claim immunity is the antithesis of accountability and justice, and it perpetuates a shoot first, ask questions later approach. The Police Qualified Immunity and Accountability Act will eliminate the state's immunity defense for an officer who causes physical or mental harm to a person and make them liable for suit under the court of law. These are officers who commit reckless actions that are outside of their training. So there is a standard in this legislation. As part of the bill, the Police Training and Standards Commission would then review any case where the officer is held liable to consider them for decertification so that that officer can never use their badge to harm a Maryland resident again. It also adjusts and increases the caps on damages that can be awarded to victims by state and local jurisdictions so that they receive their maximum justice. The bill also allows jurisdictions to forfeit pensions and recoup taxpayer dollars from settlements and judgments related to the conduct of a convicted officer. Much of our work this session has to do with prevention of police violence and misconduct, as well as accountability. And reforming police immunity is a missing piece that we have to make sure we address. There's just no way to have accountability when officers who act recklessly are shielded from being held liable without any personal responsibility. Finally, colleagues, I just want to point out some amendments to the bill that you have in front of you. I know that I have some people who are allies and supporters who are favored with amendments that I worked with on these amendments. So I want to point that out really quickly. First of all, the intent of the bill is not to limit damages. So we removed the language there around a $25,000 cap on damages awarded against the officer. The bill also makes the change to clarify that the officer and employer will be jointly and severally liable. It also clarifies that the provisions of this bill does not prevent any other remedies to injured parties that already currently exist. And I believe this legislation is an essential part of our work to reimagine public safety, and I urge a favorable report on HB 1049. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I understand Ms. Gray Hopkins is not in the back or in the waiting room, so we're going to go with Tiana Boardman, please. Tiana Boardman for 2 minutes.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Delegate Wilkins, for introducing this bill. I support House Bill 1049 because the doctrine of qualified immunity was established to protect officers from frivolous lawsuits, among other things. But what it's actually doing in practice is preventing officers and departments from being held responsible for injuries that they have caused. It's not unusual for a potential client to preface our intake conversation with, "Do you all sue cops?" Because I can't find a lawyer that will. I hear that at least 2 times every time I speak to a client. More often than not, they go on to describe disheartening and traumatic encounters with law enforcement officers that have resulted in significant physical and or psychological injuries. This doesn't even take into consideration all of the people who don't seek legal advice because they have seen how the balance of power is tilted in favor of law enforcement. This bill is not trying to strip all protection for officers or punish officers for just doing their job. Rather, it provides victims of police misconduct a fair chance to seek justice and be fairly compensated for what happened to them. The doctrine as it stands now is just much too narrow. It acts like a Teflon shield for bad cops and a barbed wire fence for the people. It perpetuates the systems of injustice that we are not directly responsible for implementing, but that we do have the responsibility and the ability to change for the better. For those reasons, among others, I'm in strong support of House Bill 1049.
Thank you very much. Samuel Shapiro. Mr. Shapiro. Mr. Shapiro. I can see him. His microphone is not muted. Mr. Shapiro? Well, he's talking now, but we can't hear him. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and we're going to go to Neil Franklin and hope that Mr. Shapiro can figure out his microphone issues there. Mr. Franklin, are you available?
I am, Mr. Chairman. How are you this afternoon?
I'm just fine. Go ahead for 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Neil Franklin. I'm a retired major from the Maryland State Police. I worked with Baltimore City as a head of training, and I've also worked with Maryland Transit, a total of 34 years in policing in the state of Maryland. I'm also representing the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, which is a nationwide group of criminal justice professionals who are doing their very best to improve policing from coast to coast. As in violent crime reduction, we go after and hold accountable the few violent members of our community. And we hold them accountable in a number of different ways, from prison to financial restitution to fines and more. The principle here is no different. We, the police, speak of the few bad apples that we have among our ranks. Well, the time has come to hold them accountable for the crimes that they commit against the people they have sworn to protect, and that is by ending qualified immunity. Police officers should be held to a higher standard than the average citizen. They are trained in the law. We provide them with proven policies to follow, policies based upon law, based upon safety and best practices. And we give them superior training in all of these things, despite what you may hear about training in policing. So this legislation will negatively affect only those who choose to intentionally violate the law, the policies they are given, and their training. That's the few bad apples. The other side of this coin is that it will dramatically improve the policing profession, which translates into improving the lives of the people and improving the lives and working conditions of the good cops. So let's help the people and let's help the good cops, to become even better cops. So please give HB 1049 a favorable report. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee.
Thank you very much. We're going to go now to Michael Winkleman, please, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Mike Winkleman, and I've practiced civil rights law in Prince George's County for more than 22 years. I'm here to support HB 1049 as it represents a chance at fairness and justice for victims of police misconduct. As you will recall, Mr. Chairman, I've been in front of this committee several times over the last few weeks to support varying pieces of legislation related to police reform. However, this bill, as well as HB 721 from last week, Delegate Moon's bill, present a very important part of police reform, the importance of an adequate remedy at law. These two pieces of legislation work in tandem with each other to address the most egregious conduct and police misconduct, and also to provide remedy to the victims, which does not exist under present Maryland law. While legislation to prevent future misconduct is important, it is equally important to provide a remedy for the victims of that future misconduct. Unfortunately, there is no amount of legislation which will prevent future misconduct, but we can pass legislation which will provide victims a remedy, which does not exist presently under Maryland law. I would also ask Mr. Chairman and members of the committee to recall that last week I had several victims here, several former clients, present clients of mine testify as to how police misconduct has impacted them. I have not called them all back this week, but we have other victims who will testify this afternoon in front of you. Please understand, though, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, those victims and their testimony applies equally to this legislation as it did to HB 721 last week. I urge your support of HB 1049 for this very important legislation and the chance to provide a remedy to victims of police misconduct in the state of Maryland. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Courtney Thomas now, please, for 2 minutes.
Hello. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for allowing me to address you this afternoon. My name is Courtney Thomas, and I'm a lawyer in Prince George's County. I testified before you last week on HB 721, and I'm back again to ask for your support of legislation that will provide a remedy for victims of police misconduct. While prevention of future misconduct is desirable, we must not forget the victims in our efforts for legislative reform. Unfortunately, history has taught us that legislation to prevent police misconduct is not enough. For more than 50 years, this country and this state has passed law after law to curb police misconduct. And every year, thousands of people who look just like me die at the hands of police. While I support efforts to prevent future misconduct, I also implore this committee to provide remedy for the victims of misconduct, which sadly history tells us will persist. As you heard last week, victims of police misconduct are treated as less than when compared to victims of car accidents. The system, due to our current laws, further victimizes those subjected by police misconduct by leaving them with no remedy for having suffered a violation of their civil rights. I'm a recent law school graduate, and I still recall one of the first principles we learned in law school. A right with no remedy is no right at all. In Maryland, under present law, many victims of police misconduct are told they have a right to be free from police misconduct, but they have no adequate remedy when this right is violated. Without an adequate remedy, they functionally have no right. I ask for your support of House Bill 1049 to provide a remedy and reinforce the rights of citizens of Maryland to be free of police misconduct. Thank you.
All right. Mr. Shapiro hasn't returned, but we do have other witnesses who we'll be hearing from, so we'll try and fit him in as we go along. But for now, let's take this panel. Are there questions for this panel? Delegate Ron Watson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Delegate Wilkins, for this bill. Quick question. I just need to make sure I understand the scenario. And tell me if this is true. If a police officer commits some misconduct resulting in damages to a victim, that victim can seek an award for damages from the employer. And as long as the employer has not contributed to those damages, the employer can seek reimbursement from that employee. Did I get that right? My chair is looking at me funny. What I'm trying to get at is, what is the responsibility of the employer of a police officer that goes rogue? The employer sets out the standards, and say an officer on his or her own accord decide not to follow those and causes damage to a victim. That victim can now come back at the employer for recompense. Is that right?
Yes.
Delegate.
Are you asking under the bill, or are you asking?
I'm reading. I have your bill up, and I'm reading the bill, and I'm looking at the part where it says the officer's employer at the local jurisdiction may seek reimbursement from the officer for any final judgment or settlement.
Right. So what the bill is doing is that currently there's a very limited ability to sue an officer directly. And so what the bill is saying is that it's offering the opportunity to ensure that the police officer cannot claim immunity so the officer can be sued directly. The bill also has a provision where if an officer is convicted of a crime that's related to that civil offense, that the jurisdiction that pays it out can actually go back to the officer to be recompensated. I'll turn it over to Mike if I don't know if I'm answering your question. I'm sorry if I don't understand the question, but I'll turn it over to Mike as well to expand on that to make sure you.
And thank you for that. And before you answer the question, Mr. Winkleman, real simply, in the military, if I give a lawful order and somebody doesn't follow that order, they do their own thing and some damages result, am I liable? And I'm trying to see how do I make that whole with the employer if we have an officer who goes rogue?
Sure, and Delegate, I think what needs to be understood in all of this is that the plaintiff still has to prove their case. So there will still be the protection under law that if an officer is acting outside of the scope of employment, then the government does not have liability when an officer is acting outside of the scope of employment. That's established law in Maryland. This legislation does not change that established law. Does that answer the question, Delegate?
It does, but it just raises the curiosity of why this piece explicitly talks about the officer's employer seeking reimbursement if that's already clear in law.
Sure. It's not clear in law, Delegate, for this reason. Right now, the way Maryland law exists, we have varying situations where the employer is responsible, whether it's under the Local Government Tort Claims Act or under the Maryland Tort Claims Act. There are different circumstances when you can sue an officer or you can't sue an officer. You only sue the state and you can't sue the state. So this cleans it up so it'd be like any other employer-employee setting. Under the general setting of Maryland law, the employer is responsible for the acts of the employee if they're acting within the scope of their employment. Under Maryland law as it exists now in police cases, that is not uniformly true. So this would apply that truism to police cases as it is to just the normal employer-employee situation. But it does not put the employer, the state, the county, whoever, on the hook for all police misconduct, particularly as you described, rogue misconduct, which would be outside of the scope of employment.
All right. Thank you, Mike. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Are there further questions for this panel? I guess I have a question. I'll throw it to the delegate or to Mr. Winkleman or whoever else would like to answer. The mental injury, an observable, identifiable, and substantial impairment of a person's mental or psychological ability to function. Can you describe what that is? What that could potentially be?
Sure, that could be the equivalent of something that I think is more commonly known as emotional distress. We were sort of looking for the right term because sometimes it might not be a physical injury, but it might be something like emotional distress. So for example, if someone, let's say, is wrongfully accused and spend 70 days in jail, which actually happened recently in Baltimore, and the officer was convicted of perjury, it might be a more of a mental injury, not necessarily a physical injury where the person was, hit or beat or something like that, but there might be an emotional distress or a mental injury that they might want to file suit. And in the example that I'm giving, it was actually a perjury situation from the officer that ended up having them be incarcerated for a number of days. So we're trying to get at not just physical, but there could be other situations where suits occur. Mike, did you want to add to that?
No, I think, well, yes. In fact, this definition also in some ways limits the legislation, but not in a negative way. As we spoke about this, and we've spoken about this with the delegate, we wanted to make sure that this legislation, or the delegate wanted to make sure this legislation addressed the most egregious of conduct or the more egregious conduct. So that was the intent of it. And by adding this predicate of some sort of mental injury, so that there could be some cognizable harm that someone would have to prove in bringing a cause of action under this legislation.
It just strikes me that it seems to me that what is in the bill, I'm not sure that it is as strong as an IIED claim. But I'll leave that to the side for a moment and move over to joint and several. So the officer who is being sued is an empty well. And now we're going over and we're going to just get the money from the jurisdiction, right?
So this is really, Mr. Chairman, in accord with all other Maryland law that allows for joint and several liability. Part of the problem with police misconduct law in the state of Maryland now is that although officers are empty wells, they have to be sued under a great many circumstances because of the way the law is structured. And there are certain cases where, or instances where the officer is then left hung out to dry. While you heard earlier testimony from Mr. Shea that Baltimore City always defends their officers and pays for the awards, that is not universally true. There are jurisdictions that don't do that. And it puts plaintiffs in very unfortunate situations, and it puts police officers in unfortunate situations that they shouldn't have to be when they're acting within the scope of their employment. So this would really just put police misconduct cases in every other, in line with every other type of civil liability in Maryland that is all joint and several.
So presumably then you would be suing both of them at the same time. You'd be suing the officer and I suppose that's what happens anyway. You're suing the officer and the jurisdiction at the same time?
So actually, Mr. Chairman, what would hopefully happen, and this legislation could cure, is what would happen in more traditional tort cases, which is then you don't always need to sue the officer. So for example, if you talk in the medical malpractice setting, if you sue a Hopkins doctor, what Hopkins always says is dismiss the doctors and just sue us because we are truly the responsible party. And so the case just maintains against Hopkins and not against the doctors. Unfortunately, the way the law is now in certain settings, we have to sue the officer and can't sue the local government, which creates this horrible situation for the officers. And frankly, was part of the reason I presume that the FOP did not fight or oppose HB 721 last week, because they understand that it actually favors the officers to be put in a situation where they don't have to be sued, but the real party in interest, the government, is the corporate entity.
So it strikes me that representations that this would somehow hold the police officer responsible for committing acts that were beyond the scope of their training or their employment are perhaps inaccurate then in this case, because this, based on what you just said, that's not what happens here. What
Mr. Chair, let me clarify.
This bill would, and I'll be, and that's not meant as a slight to Delegate Wilkins at all. It's meant sort of broadly, and perhaps future panels, and we're going to have two more, can speak to this as well. But it strikes me that if this is, I don't know that I would necessarily be opposed to a cudgel that would hold local jurisdictions more responsible, but let's call it what it is. Let's not dress it up as something else. Delegate Wilkins.
Yes, Mr. Chair, this is absolutely legislation that is holding officers directly accountable. Currently, let me explain the ways in which it does that to be absolutely clear. Currently, there is a challenge and limits around an officer being able to claim immunity and therefore not even being named and able to sue them. This legislation removes that immunity provision when someone rises, an officer conducts conduct that is misconduct outside of their training or conduct that is above mere negligence, okay? So that's the first thing, is that it removes the immunity provision so that the officer can be sued directly. The joint and several, now I'm not an attorney, but I'm doing my best to explain this, everyone. The joint and several, if there is a judgment against the officer and the employer, they are jointly liable to it. So let's say it's $100,000, the victim can then choose to make sure that they can seek the $10,000 or whatever it may be from the officer, and the rest the employer would have to then provide. They're jointly liable for the entire amount. Or in my understanding, the employer could pay the entire amount and then go back to the officer to be recompensated for the amount. They're jointly liable. So that's the point that we're trying to make, is that it's not just the employer, it's that they're jointly liable for that judgment in terms of joint and severable. Now, I do have a witness for you all, Carrie Hansel, who's coming up, who I would just ask you, Mr. Chair, to ask your question again, because he is my witness that I specifically worked with on the joint and severable, so that we can continue to explore that. Also, in terms of the bill holding officers accountable, again, when an officer commits a crime, I just gave the example of what happened in Baltimore, $100,000 paid out by the city of Baltimore for an officer that perjured themselves. This gentleman spent 70 days in prison because of this officer that perjured themselves. And the city is not able to go after the officer to be compensated for some of those funds. And that officer will receive his pension. So that's the third area that this bill addresses, is a jurisdiction then be able to go back and become compensated, and also the forfeiture of the pension. So I absolutely believe that this legislation is about holding officers personally accountable. And those are the three ways that it's done. My other witnesses have heard this conversation. I think they'll be able to further clarify.
We're going to go to Delegate Conaway, who has a question, and then we'll move on to the next panel. Delegate Conaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Delegate, for bringing this bill. Do you have any concerns that if you start charging an officer has to pay part of whatever the finding is, that there could be retaliation against the people who bring the case?
I think there's no more concern as to how it is now, when the victims are, standing up for their families and filing those lawsuits against the jurisdiction. I don't feel concern about necessary retaliation. I think it's very brave for victims to come forward and file these suits, and I don't feel a concern. But there will be victims who are testifying after me who can also share and respond to that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Delegate.
Are there further questions for this panel? All right, seeing none, thank you very much. All right, we've had two people from what was going to be the previous panel. They've shown up in the waiting room. So we'll hear from Marion Gray Hopkins, Samuel Shapiro, Nick Mosby, Reverend Kobe Little, Matthew Rogers, Richard Deans, and I think we'll stop there and then we'll take questions there. So if we can try, Marion Gray Hopkins, are you there?
I am here. Are you able to hear me?
We are, and it'll be 2 minutes. Go right ahead, please.
All right, I'll try to get this done in 2 minutes. Don't start yet. Yes, Chairman Clippinger, Vice Chair Atterbury, and committee members. Again, my name is Marion Gray Hopkins, and I live in Upper Marlboro, Maryland. So thank you for this opportunity to share my testimony on House Bill 1049, Police Qualified Immunity Accountability Act. I've been a PG County resident for almost 60 years now. And again, I live in Upper Marlboro, and I'm actively involved in many organizations, most importantly, the Coalition of Concerned Mothers, which is comprised of mothers who have lost many of them who have lost children to police brutality. And I'll just kind of jump past it, but I lost my son, Gary Hopkins Jr., at the young age of 19. He was a casualty of police violence when he came into contact with the police officers who utilized deadly force, who became the judge, jury, and executioner, and were exempt from personal liability because of this qualified immunity. I have been coming to Annapolis for many decades seeking police reform with no success. Meanwhile, the cases of deadly and excessive force by law enforcement continue to rise year after year, and officers are not being held accountable. So sadly, there's been about 21,000 deaths at the hands of law enforcement across this country since my son's death. Law enforcement cannot be allowed to continue to commit these egregious acts against citizens with immunity from civil and criminal liability. They cannot be made, cannot be above the law. So abolishing qualified immunity makes it possible for citizens to get some sense of justice. But what we really want is not to be killed or physically and mentally abused by those who pay to protect and serve us. So I feel like if officers had to pay lawsuits against them and possibly have their pensions taken away, we're bound to see a drop in these deadly force and excessive force cases. I wanted to quote a mom, Rhonda Domius, whose daughter, Corinne Gaines, was murdered by Police County SWAT in 2016. She was a private nurse and she had to have liability. And she says that private nurses and doctors carry liability insurance. So why shouldn't police be required to as well? Why should we, the citizens, pay tax dollars for their wrongdoings? Additionally, Dorothy Elliott, who you all probably know, who's been there many times, her son Archie Elliott was shot 14 times by District Heights police officers in 1993 after being searched, handcuffed, and seatbelted in a police cruiser. And she says, while we realize that this legislation will not be applied to past cases, it is important that law enforcement recognize that this act is the start of more transparency in policing and a bridge to improving trust in communicating and treating all citizens fair and just. So on behalf of my family and other impacted families, we're asking that we urge you to vote favorable on HB 1049.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank
Samuel Shapiro for 2 minutes, please.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Technology is wonderful. I come before you to support HB 1049. I have been doing police cases since about 1966. And I do think that an example is there are many fewer police cases in DC where there has been no cap on recovery and reasonable police standards were followed as the guideline. I think it is a deterrent. I think it is more of a deterrent when you make the liability joint and several, Mr. Chairman, because then the county or the city of Baltimore take an active interest, because although they may pay, they're not required to, and they take a much greater interest in seeing to it that training is proper and the few bad police officers, because these are recurring acts, are put out to pasture and are no longer members of their police force. So I would urge you to, for the betterment of the victims and for the betterment of the government, to get rid of bad police officers and help to do that by passing Bill 1049. Thank you for your patience with my technological challenge.
Okay, thank you very much. We don't see City Council President Mosby, so we're going to go to Kobe Little, please. Reverend Little.
Good afternoon again, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm Reverend Kobe Little. I represent the Maryland State Conference of the NAACP, and we're here today in support of Delegate Wilkins and House Bill 1049, which would ban qualified immunity in Maryland. I'd like to point out first that qualified immunity is the doctrine that empowers law enforcement officers to act recklessly, knowing that they will be shielded from personal liability for their actions. What's really before us today is the opportunity for this body and then the full House and General Assembly to move Maryland one step closer to a constitutional democracy and one step farther away from a police state. Police violence is in fact endemic, if not pandemic. We've seen that over the course of the last 12 months if we never saw it before. The impact of police violence is essentially terrorism, domestic terrorism. African Americans and people in other vulnerable communities live in fear of their own lives from those who are equipped, trained, licensed, and empowered to use force and to enforce the law. But too often we see these persons in fact break the law. And in law enforcement, we should see zero tolerance for breaking the law from law enforcement officers. So here's the thing. Qualified immunity as a principle came into effect in response to the civil rights movement. And the legislative efforts of the civil rights movement to eradicate white supremacy from the legal and social and economic aspects of American life. As long as qualified immunity has the opportunity to remain a legal doctrine in America, and in this case in Maryland, we will be subjecting the citizens of Maryland to white supremacist law. So the choice is yours today. You can give Marylanders the right to seek damages. You can let law enforcement officers know that they will be held liable for their actions, their violence against citizens, and the abridgment of citizens' rights. Or you can maintain the status quo, which deprives victims of the right to pursue compensatory and punitive damages, which deprives taxpayers, or which places the burden on taxpayers to pay out these claims when jurisdictions are held responsible for the actions of their officers as opposed
Reverend
to
Little.
Yes,
If
I'm
you'd wrap
wrapping
up,
up.
please.
Thank you. I think I've made the point.
Okay. Thank you very much, Reverend Little. We'll go now to Matthew Rogers, please.
And good afternoon. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it. Members of the committee, victims of these crimes, everybody who's listening in, thank you for the time to address you all today. My name is Matt Rogers. I work at a firm in Baltimore City. We represent injured persons in civil rights actions against police departments and local governments as a result of police misconduct. I'm also part of the Maryland Association for Justice, which is the largest specialty bar association in Maryland that represents injured parties and works for access to the courts. I really appreciate all of the other witnesses addressing sort of the practical implications of this bill. I wanted to focus for a minute on the messaging that the bill sends to the community, though, which I think is just as, if not more important. I can't tell you how frustrating it is to explain to my clients who were injured by police misconduct that the officer who injured them is completely immune from liability. The message that that sends to our community, that the people who are supposed to be protecting the community, who are supposed to be enforcing the laws, can break them, can injure people, and they are immune from liability. It is an incredibly difficult conversation to have, to say the least. And the message that this bill would send to the communities that the officers are supposed to be protecting is that nobody is above the law. As we have learned from our earliest civics classes on, the President of the United States on down is not above the law. And the immunity bills actually show very clearly that there are people above the law. And in this case, getting rid of that language that the officer who hurts somebody is immune from liability is a very strong message to our community that this type of behavior will simply not be tolerated moving forward. Of course, the practical implications of the bill are important as well. Getting rid of the cap in a way that aligns it more with other injury bills in the state of Maryland is extremely important. And it also, I think, is important to note, makes the idea of police brutality it essentially directs the government entities to resolve these issues, to get into the systemic problems that are presented and ultimately to try to root them out. So we are very much in favor of the bill. We hope that you all will be as well. And we hope that we can send the message to the community that this type of behavior will simply not be tolerated and that those who perpetrate it will not be immune from civil liability. Mr. Chair, thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. We don't have Mr. Mosby. We don't have Mr. Deans. I'm going to ask staff to see if we can get Lawrence Greenberg in the room. Alex Pepra. We have either one of them. All right, I see Alex Pepra. Ms. Alex Pepra?
Yes, sir.
All right, go ahead. You have 2 minutes to testify.
Thank you, sir. My name is Alex Pepra. I'm an Uber driver. And I would like to briefly share this painful experience with Howard County Police. Some time ago, while driving for Uber in Columbia, I find myself being followed by the police after dropping somebody off in front of his house. They followed me, pulled me over, and with their PA system instructed me to stick my 2 hands out of the window, to which I immediately complied. They surrounded my car with their guns drawn, and at gunpoint, they forcibly pulled me out of the car, even while I was still in my seatbelt. When they had finally removed me from the car, and while I was not resisting, I was knocked out. I was knocked down in my lower back from behind with such force. I still have pains in my lower back till this day. They also planted a knee in my lower back and pinned me down, causing me excruciating pain, handcuffed me, and patted me down for weapons while I was lying on the pavement face down. They searched my entire car, including the trunk, and then placed me at the back seat of a police cruiser for about 1 hour with my hands painfully cuffed behind my back. After that, 2 officers joined me in the police cruiser to remove the handcuffs and speak with me for the very first time. Even that was to subject me to another 45 minutes of interrogation. But they found nothing on me or in my car, and also neither my person nor my car even fit the description of whoever they were looking for. They then released me after all that while saying to me that I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. So what did I do wrong? I may wonder. Perhaps I dropped somebody off in front of his house, which house was approximately a quarter of a mile too close to a stolen item on the side of the road that the police were monitoring. Now, as I try to live my life, in the midst of the adverse impact this has had on my health and my life, I effectually and fervently pray that this does not happen to anyone in the future. I thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll hear now from Lawrence Greenberg.
Good afternoon, Chair. And Delegate Wilkins, Vice Chair, panel. My name is Larry Greenberg. Like others who have come before me and who will follow, I'm a trial lawyer. I realized this morning that I've spent half my life protecting those who have been needlessly injured and killed by others. I speak today both personally and as past president and co-chair of the Maryland Association for Justice's Civil Rights Section. And as Mr. Rogers said, we are the largest group of civil rights lawyers in Maryland. We are requesting a favorable report on House Bill 1049. This bill will help resolve the inequities that arise when officers are immune from civil and criminal liability for acts and omissions caused by certain physical or mental injury that occur while the officer is acting in official capacity. As Mr. Winkleman explained earlier, this bill actually helps individual officers. You will hear from witnesses. I know you already heard from one, but you're going to hear from Nicole Wallace and Makia Smith. They have testified before your committee before. Both women, both 2 strong women's lives have been significantly changed because the system does not work. Their braveness amazes me. Delegate Watson asked specifically today regarding retaliation. And I will tell you, every time I speak with them, they fear, especially in forums like this, they fear that it will come back, but that will not stop them. And hopefully, by speaking out and unmasking those who violated them, it'll prevent others from being abused. The system does not police their own. There's no incentive to change. I can tell you personally on one of the cases, I sat for a day and went through file after file of prior police misconduct. Those officers were still on the force, those officers were still being paid, and they continue to get benefits. Through the courageous efforts of Delegate Wilkins and others in the legislature, hopefully this year will bring change. We ask for a favorable report on House Bill 1049. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's hear from Carrie Hansel, please, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's good to be with you again. My name is Kerry Hansel. I'm a civil rights lawyer. I'm here in favor of House Bill 1049. It does a couple of important things, but I think it's first important to remind ourselves what it applies to. It only applies to cases that meet a heightened standard under the bill. So for instance, the case must rise above mere negligence, and also, as has been pointed out in the questioning earlier, must deal with actual physical or mental injury as defined in the bill further. So there is only a small subset of cases that it applies to. It's those that are meeting that heightened standard. In those cases, it does two things to bring civil rights cases in line with every other case in Maryland. The first is that it gets rid of immunities that only apply to police officers. These immunities are things that don't apply to any other potential defendant in Maryland and create a lopsided playing field for people seeking justice. They also bring the caps in line in this elevated set of cases with every other case in Maryland. So the second part of the bill references other caps that apply in every other case. So as I've testified before for this committee, the current caps in Maryland are hundreds of thousands of dollars less in police cases for the simple reason that we're dealing with police. This bill remedies that wrong and brings these cases, that worst case scenario that it applies to, more in line with other law. It does not elevate police cases above other situations. As to the joint and several liability, Mr. Chair, I'm happy to address your question during my testimony, but if I need a moment longer, if you'll ask it again, I'd appreciate it. The issue with joint and several liability is this. We see as civil rights lawyers repeatedly that officers are not rogue officers. That concept rarely exists. What we see is officers who have repeated instances of misconduct, tens and dozens of prior instances, who are not weeded out by their departments. So there is and should be shared responsibility between the department and the officer. And the function of joint and several liability is to place in the victim's hands the decision of where and how to collect a judgment. So I have many victims who would rather collect some or all of their judgment from the officer who was involved. And there have been issues also discussed today about how best to address police misconduct. I will suggest to you that this bill and Delegate Moon's bill from last week, House Bill 721, place addressing police misconduct where it belongs, which is in the hands of the citizens in the form of juries. And it ensures that their rulings are fair and just because it allows for their review by the trial judge and appellate.
Mr. Ansel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to address this committee. I thank Delegate Wilkins and I urge a favorable report on House Bill 1049. Thank you.
Are there questions for this panel before we go to the opponents? Seeing none, thank you all very much. That concludes the testimony in favor of House Bill 1049. We're now going to go to the opponents to House Bill 1049. Angelica Bailey, Chaz Ball, Michael Sanderson, Karen Kruger. Each of them will get 2 minutes. We're going to start to welcome them into the Zoom room. We'll ask the previous people to testify in favor of Is Angelica Bailey on the line?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I am. Hello.
Great. Go right ahead for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman and members of the committee. I'm Angelica Bailey, Director of Government Relations for the Maryland Municipal League. We are here to testify in opposition of House Bill 1049. I'll be quick. I know it's been a long day. We understand that these are important and complex issues. Our main concern is the bill's financial implications for local governments. The fiscal note sums it up well. There would be significant increases for us to pay the judgment awards under this bill, to litigate the claims that would be brought, and to pay the increased insurance premiums for the increased liability coverage that we would need under this bill. And those premiums would go up for all local governments, even those without police departments. Our members are already struggling financially right now, so we must respectfully request an unfavorable report. Thank you.
Chaz Ball, please.
Good afternoon. I'd like to, I'm Chaz Ball, I'm speaking on behalf of the state FOP as counsel. I'd like to start with this, and I'd like anyone under the sound of my voice to hear me and understand this. Qualified immunity does not exist as to Maryland state claims. Qualified immunity does not exist as to Maryland state claims. There's the Local Government Tort Claims Act, which actually requires that an individual officer, as opposed to the municipality, is sued. So under the Local Government Tort Claims Act, the officer has to be sued. Under the Maryland Tort Claims Act, as in place right now, the officer can be sued directly if there's an allegation of gross negligence or that the officer acted with actual malice. Both allow for the individual officer to be sued, and under the Local Government Tort Claims Act, as of right now, the officer has to be the one that's sued. Now, what the main impact of this is, and one of the reasons that the MAJ is so involved in this and plaintiffs' attorneys are so happy to hear this bill, is that it would eliminate the caps on local governments, on the state government. And further, my colleague, Mr. Winkleman, he was frank in saying that in allowing a joint and several liability, what it allows is for the person to sue, plaintiff to sue both the Baltimore Police Department and the individual officer. And the reason why a plaintiff wants to do that is because the Baltimore Police Department sounds like a big entity with a lot of money, and a jury, frankly, may be more likely to award less with the individual officer. This is something that goes towards getting plaintiffs more money, but doesn't serve the purposes that this act is supposed to say. And the last part I'd like to add is that this bill creates per se liability, if you read the language of it, because it says an officer causes physical or mental injury to another person through an act or omission committed while the officer is acting in official capacity is liable to the injured person for legal, equitable, or any other relief. That's it's in 51302 A2. So if you sue under the Local Government Tort Claims Act and use this statute as part of it, then there's no defenses to it. It's per se liability for any injury. Thank you.
Michael Sanderson for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, committee members. Michael Sanderson with the Maryland Association of Counties. We've submitted written testimony, and I'll try and fill in some observations around what you've heard from other witnesses. First, I think the questions and interchange you've already had about this bill has served to illuminate that its application in Maryland is at best really confusing. What exactly does it mean to get rid of qualified immunity in Maryland when that isn't really a legal doctrine for the kind of cases we're talking about is hard to piece together. It's a better fit for other states in all candor. The bill leaves us not really sure who pays and when there ends up being a judgment or a settlement. I will add, I don't think you've heard this before, but if you're interested in this bill, please fully explore the legal issues with sheriffs, deputies, because as constitutional officers, they're fundamentally different than law enforcement, than police officers under a county or city police department. It's a different avenue, and I don't think anyone's talked about this matter satisfactorily. If you are not getting testimony association, I hope you seek that out. But another thing that I want the committee to think about is what happens if an individual officer actually committed a crime, raped someone, or something that's clearly outside the scope of employment or the scope of the job. The current Tort Claims Act separates those cases out. This bill doesn't clearly do that. And I'm not sure that's what the sponsor or the drafter's intent is here, but this bill would need some real attention on that front. We know that there's another element of the bill with sort of higher dollar amounts and potential for larger settlements and attorneys' fees and so forth. You heard an earlier testimony on another bill earlier today about federal cases versus state cases, claims, and whether you go into federal court. This bill, bigger dollars and bigger attorney's fees, that sounds like federal court, but it doesn't have the provisions of federal court. There's no offer of judgment. There's not a number of those procedural provisions that make federal court make sense in a larger context. This bill doesn't incorporate all that. If the committee wants to put the taxpayers and the governments on the hook for more dollars, if that's the policy direction you want to go, in all candor, you've got a cleaner bill to do that. We oppose that bill as well, but at least in the debate about House Bill 721, you've got a bill that we can all understand what it would mean and what it applies to.
Sanderson.
This bill doesn't have that strong footing. Thank you, Mr.
Very much. Karen Kruger for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon again. Speaking on behalf of the Maryland Chiefs of Police Association and Maryland Sheriff's Association, also would like to note that I am the author of an article on governmental immunity that was published in the University of Baltimore Law Review. One of the reasons I wrote that article is because this is a very confusing and difficult area of law. I'd just like to quickly clarify a couple of points. One is no government employees have criminal immunity. That can only be granted by a prosecutor. Secondly, there are 3 categories of governmental employees and officials who have absolute immunity, those being judges, prosecutors, and members of the General Assembly. All other state, local, county employees and officials have only very limited, substantially limited governmental immunity, which allows them to do their jobs without fear of constantly being sued for every decision they might make. So there's no immunity for acts that are committed with malice or gross negligence. There's no immunity for acts committed outside the scope of employment. There's generally no immunity for violations of the state constitution or for intentional torts. There's no immunity for ministerial decisions. And as Mr. Ball pointed out, local government employees don't have immunity. They may have a right to indemnification, but there's no immunity there either. So what you will be doing here is stripping even these modest protections for officers, and only police officers, who commit good faith mistakes within the scope of their duties, put their livelihoods at risk, put their families at risk for personal liability. And it's not surprising that we have a group of plaintiffs' attorneys in support of this bill, which awards attorneys' fees as well. But what governmental immunity is intended to do is to provide structural protection for democratic rule and continuity of government. It's not to protect bad actors, and it doesn't protect bad actors. This bill just goes too far and is very punitive on police officers, and we urge an unfavorable report. Thank you.
Are there questions for this panel? Seeing none, but seeing Delegate Lopez's hand a couple times, but seeing none, we thank you very much, and that concludes the testimony on House Bill 1049. Thank you very much. We are now going to our final bill of the afternoon, which is House Bill 809. The sole witness for this bill is Delegate Keith Haynes. Delegate Haynes. Delegate Haynes. Going once. Twice. My office has attempted to be in contact with Delegate Haynes, has reached out to Delegate Haynes' office. There is no one here to testify on this bill. So with that concludes the testimony on House Bill 809. Thank you very much. All right, now it is 5:12. We are done for the afternoon. We will be back tomorrow for further bills at 1:30. There are several, might be a few more witnesses than today. We thank you all for watching, and we look forward to being with you again tomorrow. Thank you very much.